Hey guys, tonight, we're taking a turn down a fog-covered alleyway that leads straight into the world of love in medieval Europe, a time when a confession of affection might come with a marriage contract, a handwritten hymn, or an ill-considered curse in Latin. This was an age when heartbreak wasn't soothed with ice cream and sad music, but with candlelit prayers, or by challenging your romantic rival to a duel with actual weapons. And if you think love today is complicated, just wait until you hear about knights trying to impress with calligraphy, falcons, and suits of armor polished to a gleam with cow fat. So, before we dive into this world of courtship tangled in rituals and sky-high chances of awkward disaster, if you think this strange little time machine deserves a few minutes of your quiet evening, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. And I'd really love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Leave a comment. Your messages are like tiny flickering lanterns lighting the path of this journey. Now, dim the lights, pour yourself something warm, and if you like, turn on a small fan to mimic the wind in the woods. Let your body relax, close your eyes if you want, because we're about to enter a world where love could kill you. Literally, you're at court, not necessarily because you were born into nobility, but more likely due to a well-placed favor, a long-forgotten political debt, or a second cousin who once gifted a goat at just the right moment. The air is thick with a mix of lavender, beeswax, and lard. Every breath reminds you that wealth in these halls isn't just seen, it's smelled. The stone walls are draped with heavy banners embroidered in jewel-toned silks, colors legally reserved for those of status and coin. And right in the middle of this elegant, murmuring swirl of clinking goblets and clashing egos, there you are, trying to flirt. But don't expect anything like a modern romantic comedy. This isn't a world of awkward eye contact and text messages sent at 2 a.m. Here, getting someone's attention might involve pretending to be a jester. Not metaphorically. Literally. You might find yourself crossing your eyes, puffing out your cheeks, juggling apples, or reciting a biting satire while crouched like a frog. Absurd as it may sound, this behavior wasn't just permitted in some circles, it was actively encouraged, especially in the courts of southern France. In particular, the 12th century court of Aquitaine, ruled by the formidable Eleanor, was known for its lavish courts of love. Their theatrical flair was a form of currency. And subtlety was considered boring, wit, you see, was everything. A sharp tongue could cut through more social barriers than a noble title. If you could make the person you desired laugh, or better yet, puzzle them with a well-crafted riddle, you were already halfway toward winning their affection. Historians still debate whether these famed courts of love were actual institutions with formal procedures or just the literary fantasies of nobles who had too much time and too many quills. Either way, the idea embedded itself deeply in the romantic imagination of the time. Imagine this, you're at a grand feast. The roast swan is already overcooked and leathery. A harpist in the corner plucks aimlessly at his strings with the weary look of someone paid by the note. Across the candlelit hall, you spot someone, elegant, mysterious, and sipping from a goblet while wearing a velvet hat that practically screams unattached and influential. What's your next move? You drop into a courtly bow so deep your forehead nearly touches the rushes on the floor, then launch into a flowery sonnet about how their beauty causes turnips to weep in shame. If they chuckle, you're on the right track. If they don't, perhaps try again, but with beets or parsnips this time. Because here, the performance mattered just as much as the content. Passion in the Middle Ages was not whispered in corners or scribbled in diaries. It was played out in front of an audience, like a cross between theater and competitive sport. You weren't just wooing a person. You were proving to the entire court that you were worthy of romantic attention. Fail to be entertaining, and you'd be forgotten. Worse, you could be upstaged by someone with a more flamboyant peacock feather or a monkey that could do cartwheels. Yes, pet monkeys were surprisingly common. And so were leashed leopards, at least among the exceptionally eccentric. Even in all this spectacle, there were rules. You couldn't be too direct. You couldn't speak too plainly. If you liked someone's hair, you had to wrap that compliment in metaphor, comparing it to molten gold, sunlit threads, or perhaps the flowing mane of a celestial lion. If you missed someone, it had to be described in terms of aching for a holy relic lost during the Crusades. Subtlety, in its most baroque and convoluted form, was essential, and yet, within all this flowery performance, the line between jest and sincerity often blurred. Court jesters were frequently the only ones permitted to speak truths that others dared not utter, though they still had to coat their words in jokes. These jesters could tease out hidden affections, pass along coded messages, or deliver romantic notes disguised as comedic barbs. In some households, they essentially served as early matchmakers, navigating the tricky waters of courtly love while wearing jingling hats and mismatched shoes. One particularly memorable piece of advice from medieval love manuals, yes, those existed, and some were surprisingly thorough, warned the reader to make your beloved laugh, but never let them laugh at you. The difference was razor thin. In an era where reputation was currency, becoming the butt of a joke could mean social ruin. Of course, for every charming jester in a duke's court, there were a dozen hopeful fools performing clumsy sonnets in drafty lesser halls, armed with cheap rhymes and even cheaper props. You can practically hear the collective groan as a desperate young squire attempts to win hearts by balancing a tankard on his head, again. Romance wasn't just high stakes. It was downright competitive. And frequently absurd. Still, this bizarre tradition wasn't just theatrical fluff. It had intellectual roots. Troubadours, those wandering lyricists and musicians, weren't merely romantic drifters. They were the architects of a cultural movement. Their poems, composed in Occitan or Old French, shaped how generations of lovers expressed their longing and loyalty. Their verses were dense with metaphor and symbolism, fixated on impossible love and noble suffering. The goal wasn't necessarily to win the beloved, it was to yearn for them in the most poetic and impressive way possible, and don't be fooled into thinking this whole dance belonged to men alone. Noble women were just as adept in the art of flirtation. They wielded fans like weapons, exchanged glances with the precision of swordplay, and knew exactly which scarf to drop into which knight's lap to spark a week's worth of speculation. But we'll delve deeper into their techniques next time. For now, you remain in the banquet hall, mentally debating whether your interpretive dance based on the Iliad will earn you admiration, or a swift trip to the stocks. Also, it's worth mentioning, hygiene wasn't exactly consistent. You might be trying to flirt while suppressing a gag. Scents were powerful and sometimes overpowering. Musk, ambergris, rosewater, and cloves were common ingredients in perfumes, which were often applied with more hope than discretion. If someone smelled good, it meant they were either rich, had bathed recently, which was rare and notable, or had access to spices, which made them very attractive by default. You adjust your sleeves, which may be finely embroidered with your family crest if you're well off, or decorated with wax imitations if your budget is more imaginative than your lineage. You inhale deeply, duck around a wandering chicken pecking near your foot, and prepare to recite your next sonnet. Perhaps it will be about the moon. Or perhaps about how your beloved's eyes resemble candle flames flickering in the gloom of a forgotten chapel. Just remember the most essential rule of medieval romance: be clever, never crass. Be humorous, but avoid being a fool. And above all else, always check that your fly isn't open. That's a piece of advice that has survived the centuries for a reason. You're outside now. Technically, you haven't left the court, but you've begun to drift toward its softer edges, the parts where the grandeur fades, the laughter quiets, and the torches no longer blaze with the same assertive brightness. Instead, they flicker hesitantly, casting long shadows that dance across the worn stones and offer a gentler cover for your social unease. Here, in the dim periphery, everything feels just slightly removed from the spectacle. It is quieter, less polished, and somehow more intimate. You are holding a handkerchief. Not one of your own. It is silken, soft in texture, and clearly expensive. embroidered with what appeared to be either stylized peonies or possibly small dragons that were imagined by someone who had only ever heard of dragons through third-hand gossip. Whatever the design, it was made with care, and even more importantly, it was dropped with intention. Because the person who dropped it left behind not just fabric, but a smile. One that lingered, just a breath too long, as if daring you to notice. Welcome to the ancient and delicate art of the drop. In medieval courtship, objects were not merely decorative or passive. They were active players in a complex game. A glove, a ribbon, a carved wooden token, any of these could be released from one's fingers and allowed to fall with an air of careless grace. But the fall was never truly accidental. It was a move, often rehearsed, and delivered with precision. It was a message wrapped in silk. An invitation concealed within etiquette. And if you happened to notice it at just the right moment, if you were observant enough to see and courteous enough to act, you might unlock a cascade of meaning, a grateful glance, a murmured thank you, or perhaps the slow unfolding of a flirtation that lasted not days or weeks, but the length of an entire season. You may be tempted to dismiss this as something belonging to later centuries, to powdered wigs and ballroom drama, but you would be mistaken. The medieval world adored symbols. With so many rules, so many social barriers, and so many risks involved in simply saying what you felt, gestures became the language of longing. And among them, the drop stood out as both subtle and electrifying. It was their version of sending a signal. If a wink is the emoji of modern flirtation, then a dropped handkerchief was its medieval ancestor, equal parts daring and decorous, yet this practice, like everything in love, came with rules. Timing mattered. To retrieve the handkerchief too quickly made you look overeager. Perhaps even desperate. To wait too long gave space for another, quicker suitor to swoop in, knees cracking but victorious. And even the way you picked it up mattered. Did you bow low and offer it with humble hands? Did you grip it by the hem or by the folded corner, as though afraid to disturb its scent? Did you tuck it gently into your palm, treating it like a relic recovered from some distant pilgrimage? Each of these choices sent a different message. Small movements. Enormous meanings. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Was it part of everyday courtship across Europe, or confined mostly to the theatrical courts of Burgundy, Avignon, and other places where excess and repression lived in constant tension? What is clear is that the handkerchief was far from alone. Women might also accidentally drop a ribbon from their hair, a bloom from a carefully arranged garland, or, in especially bold moments, a single bead from a rosary. That last one tread dangerously close to the edge, flirting with sacrilege as much as romance. One curious case survives in a letter from 14th century Italy. It tells of a noble woman who, during a lavish midsummer feast, dropped her embroidered sleeve ribbon. Not once, but twice. The first time, the knight she fancied returned it with a respectful nod and a whisper. The second time, he pressed it gently to his lips before handing it back. At the third feast, she appeared in an entirely different gown, wearing ribbons of another color entirely, and never once looked in his direction. Whatever he had done, it was either too little or far too much. Medieval love was not a place for hesitation, nor was it forgiving to those who misunderstood the moment, and not all drops involved objects. Sometimes the item being tossed into the arena was far more ephemeral. A murmured line from a known love poem. A sigh just loud enough to be heard. A half-sentence spoken as you pass someone in the corridor. These were emotional handkerchiefs, cast into the air like bait. If your intended caught them, responded in kind, matched your tone or your metaphor, then the dance could begin. If they didn't, you were left clutching your intentions, waiting for the next jousting tournament to try again. Naturally, not everyone played by the rules. Some took the art of the drop to absurd, almost comical lengths. There are tales, some likely exaggerated, of troubadours who trained their falcons to deliver silk tokens straight through open windows into the hands of their beloveds. This level of commitment was either deeply romantic or slightly concerning. It was hard to tell. And while such displays might seem grand, they flirted with the edges of feudal law. Sending a bird into someone's private chambers could be interpreted in several ways, not all of them legal. Even among the lower classes, the drop retained its charm. For those without embroidered silk, the tokens were simpler. Homespun wool, small carvings of bone or wood, maybe a flower tucked discreetly into the fold of an apron. One bloom meant affection. A broken one might mean that affection had found another recipient. Nuance mattered, even in the simplest villages, yet as with all romantic customs, the drop also had a darker side. In some places, women were warned never to drop anything in the presence of certain men, particularly those who had a habit of twisting accidents into opportunities. A single glove, fallen by chance, could be turned into supposed proof of intent. In some regions, customs were so specific that a dropped scarf might be argued as a public signal of betrothal. One wrong move, one misplaced item, and you could find yourself at the center of unwanted speculation or worse, an unwanted proposal with legal weight behind it. There were even reports of men flipping the game entirely. They would drop something that belonged to the woman, stolen or borrowed, and then return it to her in a public show of gallantry, hoping to score affection through theatrics. The nerve. But perhaps unsurprising in an era when powdered deer antler was considered a legitimate ingredient in love potions, and men proudly wore peacock feathers as fashion statements. Perspective is everything. Among the elite, the ritual became almost like theater. Entire feasts, gatherings, or seasonal balls could turn into elaborate games of symbolic exchange. Who dropped what, who retrieved it, and how, that became the silent drama playing beneath the surface. It was medieval speed dating, if speed dating required a herald and the involvement of your entire extended household. Even the materials held meaning. A red silk handkerchief suggested fiery passion. White linen whispered innocence, or at least the cultivated appearance of it. Embroidery with vines implied growth, perhaps fertility. A thorny rose hinted at love's sting. And thistles? Thistles meant rejection. Polite, artistic, unmistakable rejection. One nobleman wrote in a poem that he received a ribbon sewn with tiny silver bells. Every time he moved, the bells chimed softly, reminding him of the lady's laughter. At first, this seemed sweet. Then you learn he tied it to his sword hilt and carried it into battle. Whether that was devotion or delusion, no one can really say. But one thing is certain. Romance during this time was never subtle for long. It started in whispers and ended in epics. Naturally, the church weighed in as well. Some priests railed against such displays as vanity, or worse, temptation draped in velvet. Others said nothing at all, too busy trying to prevent public kissing during Lent or dancing on feast days. Their usual romantic advice was short, stern, and usually began and ended with the word no. Unsurprisingly, this approach had mixed success, and now, here you are, standing just beyond the edge of the revelry, still holding that handkerchief. It has grown warmer in your hand, touched by the heat of your skin. The faint scent of orris root, that old powdered fragrance used to perfume linens, still lingers on the fabric. You think about what to do. Return it now with a quiet word and a careful smile. Or tuck it into the folds of your doublet and let the anticipation stretch longer, like beeswax softening near a fire. The right choice could lead to weeks of glances stolen across crowded rooms and notes passed between goblets. The wrong one might mean nothing more than awkward silences and long, lonely walks past the goat pens. So you square your shoulders, breathe in slowly, smooth your sleeve, and step forward. Your heart beats steadily, your eyes stay soft, and the corners of your mouth lift in a smile that is just wistful enough to be interesting. But just as your hand begins to rise, just as you prepare to offer the handkerchief back with all the dignity you can summon, someone else appears. They move faster, bow deeper, and extend the silk with a flourish you cannot match. Love, medieval style. A game of inches. A test of timing. An endless parade of embroidery, glances, and carefully dropped hints. You're still reeling from that handkerchief snatch. Your rival moved like he had rehearsed it for weeks. He bowed lower than necessary, smiled with a flash of teeth that seemed unfairly symmetrical, and probably smelled faintly of rosewater mixed with an irritating hint of well-fed smugness. But you don't panic. You remind yourself that this is just the opening move. The game of medieval courtship is not decided in a single gesture. It has barely begun. And now, it is time for a different kind of approach, one less about embroidery and more about alchemy, plants, and the occasional powdered frog, yes. Frog. And garlic. You are about to step into the sharply scented, sometimes questionable world of medieval love potions and herbal flirtation strategies. Some of these concoctions were more romantic gesture than science, others veered dangerously close to poison. A few might have made you more alluring. Others might have made you smell like someone's dinner. But all of them promised one thing, a chance at romance. Let's begin with something that is still very much with us today, scent. In a world where bathing was viewed by many as suspicious or even morally compromising, and where soap was available but not particularly adored, the way you smelled mattered deeply. If someone noticed your presence before they saw you, that could either be a very good or a very bad sign. Garlic, for all of its associations with repelling creatures of the night, was thought to stir passion. It was believed to awaken the blood and warm the humors. It could be eaten raw, rubbed onto crusts of bread, or even simmered into mulled wine to create a kind of rustic aphrodisiac. The results, however, were not guaranteed. Your breath might become bold and your confidence might rise, but so too would the likelihood of being avoided on shared bench seating during a feast. Love manuals from the time, which, yes, were a real genre of literature, offered a variety of curious suggestions. One recurring theme was the use of hot spices to invigorate romantic energy. These included cloves, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, and cardamom. Taken internally, usually with wine or bread, they were believed to excite the spirit and embolden the lover. The logic, though dubious by today's standards, was built on the medieval theory of humors. If your body was too cold or sluggish, it needed to be heated, stoked like a fire until your romantic courage burned bright. One particularly bold recipe comes from a 13th century alchemist who advocated for a morning tonic made of steeped rosemary, aged vinegar, grated nutmeg, and powdered oyster shell. This elixir, taken at dawn on an empty stomach, was said to cause a fluttering in the chest, a poetic lightness of mood, and, in unfortunate cases, severe nausea. The instructions warned of overconsumption. Given that vomiting and flotation rarely mix well, it was presumably meant to be consumed with restraint. Historians are still undecided on whether any of these concoctions had actual physiological effects or if their power came purely from belief. But that belief was not a small thing. If someone truly thought they had taken something that would make them irresistible, they likely behaved that way. And in many medieval settings, confidence could carry you further than actual beauty. Charm, after all, was often louder than hygiene. And much easier to fake. Of course, some remedies strayed far into the realm of the bizarre. More obscure love potions might call for powdered beetles, dried bat wings, or shavings from a unicorn horn, which, in practice, meant ground narwhal tusks sold by enterprising merchants. Among the wealthier and more eccentric, crushed emeralds were sometimes added to drinks as a display of extravagance and, allegedly, to increase passion. Whether these worked is anyone's guess. They probably tasted terrible and certainly cost a fortune. One French recipe, circulated among nobles and quietly condemned by priests, called for soaking a lover's linen undergarments in a potion made of bloodroot, vinegar, and trace amounts of nightshade. The goal was to bind their desire to the potion brewer. The actual outcome ranged from mild headaches to unconsciousness, depending on the dosage. It was a method both obsessive and highly illegal in many regions. Another documented charm instructed lovesick individuals to write the name of their desired partner on a slip of parchment, soak it in menstrual blood, and then hide it beneath the target's pillow. This was thought to create a magical tether between two hearts. Whether this induced affection or night terrors is hard to say. But it does underscore just how deeply people wanted to believe that love could be conjured with enough creativity and bodily fluids. Then there's the more eccentric garlic on the foot method. In some Slavic traditions, people believed that rubbing garlic on the soles of your feet before a romantic encounter would make your words more persuasive. The reasoning is murky. Some say it was believed to stimulate nerve endings. Others suspect it was just a folk belief passed down by people who didn't question why their suitors smelled so intensely. Either way, it was practiced. As was the even stranger idea that swallowing powdered pearls could make your skin glow with youthful vitality. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Beyond ingestible potions, there were wearable charms and scent capsules. Known as love apples, these were hollow balls made from wax or resin, filled with fragrant herbs, crushed flowers, or bits of scented wood. People wore them on chains around the neck or tucked into sleeves. As they moved, the scent would drift gently into the air, leaving an impression of mystery and, ideally, desirability. Given the less than pleasant ambient aromas of the time, this technique was less about seduction and more about being the person who didn't smell like rotting meat or mildew. Which was a major social advantage. In 1398, a London apothecary noted that his most requested perfume included musk, civet, which comes from the glands of cat-like animals, and rosemary. He also sold something labeled tongue scrapings of doves, though scholars are still debating whether this was literal, poetic, or simply an inside joke that got lost to history. The apothecary's shop famously burned down 2 years later. Whether that was divine punishment or an unfortunate candle accident, no one can say. Wine, of course, played its own role in romance. Spiced wines, often referred to as hippocras, were served at banquets and infused with everything from honey and cloves to occasionally dubious ingredients that bordered on the psychedelic. After a few cups, inhibitions loosened. You might confess your true feelings. Or you might mistake a noblewoman's lapdog for your own long-lost cousin. As always, romance carried its risks. The church, naturally, was not amused. To ecclesiastical authorities, these potions were at best indulgent distractions and at worst, tools of the devil. Some bishops denounced love charms as sinful manipulations of free will. Others warned that users of aphrodisiacs would face eternal damnation. Still, not everyone in the clergy abstained. One abbot from 15th century Bavaria penned a curiously detailed guide about the scents of Eden and how they might assist in holy matrimonial readiness. It was not widely published, but it was copied enthusiastically by monks with suspiciously scented robes. Outside of potions, people turned to nature for romantic guidance. Omens abounded. If a bird circled your home before you made a confession, it was a good sign. If the wind blew from the east, rejection was foretold. If a toad croaked 3 times as you looked into someone's eyes, you might be destined to marry, or be accused of dark magic. Interpretations varied from village to village. Young women sometimes placed sprigs of basil, lavender, or rosemary under their pillows in the hopes of dreaming about their future husbands. Others wrote names on onions and planted them in small pots. The first to sprout was said to predict their future spouse. If none sprouted at all, it was either time to become a nun or to switch to stronger fertilizer. And yes, there were songs, Real love ballads, dedicated to garlic. One particularly enthusiastic piece from the region of Provence compares a lover's breath to the evening kitchen hearth. Warm and thick with the promise of stew. Their kiss, according to the poet, was like the first spoonful of broth on a winter's night. It was meant as a compliment. Whether it succeeded depends on how hungry the listener was. You, standing now in your chamber, clutching a little leather pouch of dried cloves, eyeing a suspicious mug of tea that smells faintly of thyme and vinegar, finally understands something fundamental. Love in the Middle Ages was not a fast pursuit. Feelings were not simply confessed. They were steeped, brewed, wrapped in linen sachets, and prayed over. They were drunk, sniffed, and whispered into folded parchment. And often, they were endured with clenched teeth and a strong stomach, but even under the weight of garlic breath and questionable elixirs, one truth glimmered. Medieval hearts wanted what hearts have always wanted. Connection. Attention. A spark that outlasts the feast. Someone who, even if they smell a little odd, smells odd in a way that feels like home, so you take another bite of your garlic-rubbed bread, chase it with a cautious sip of Hippocras, and whisper a quick prayer that whoever you meet next won't pass out before you get the chance to smile. The quill is scratching, it echoes faintly beneath the low murmur of rain against the shuttered window, and the occasional hiss from the hearth as a drop sneaks down the chimney. Evening has settled in, somewhere between the 7th and 8th bell. The sky outside has dimmed to a gentle charcoal, the kind of twilight that feels both endless and fleeting. You've just lit the final stub of a tallow candle in your cramped chamber, watching as it flickers uncertainly in the chill. The walls breathe with the damp. The beams creak with every gust. Shadows pool like ink around the corners, and now, with great care, you have dabbed your ink, trimmed your feather to a whisper-fine point, and set your parchment precisely in the center of your small, rough-hewn table, because tonight, you are writing a love letter. This is not a quick note. This is not a passing whisper or a sly glance. It is not the hurried pulse of a text or the casual click of an email. This is a task that demands silence, patience, and more emotional drama than most marriages will ever see. A medieval love letter is not communication. It is art. It is obsession. It is a trembling, fragrant scroll of metaphors, half-remembered Latin, and feelings so swollen with sincerity that even a monastery would blush. You are not aiming for subtlety. You are going to absolutely overdo it. You begin with the salutation. It cannot be plain. It cannot be safe. You need something that aches. Something that sighs from the first syllable. To my sweet torment. To the flame who burns in the cathedral of my solitude. To she who reigns over the aching halls of my heart. Nothing so weak as high. Never anything so flippant as hey. You are attempting to compress a whole tragic opera into the first line of a letter. The body is where you unleash the full pageantry of longing. Knights, monks, minor poets, and idle nobles all spilled ink across vellum and parchment comparing their beloveds to birds, flowers, and divine beings with almost reckless enthusiasm. Eyebrows became the wings of falcons. Ankles were transformed into ivory columns. Laughter rang like bells in a cloister at dawn. Teeth were pearls, eyes were stars, and a sigh from the beloved could be described as the gentle death of 1,000 roses. Whether any of it made sense was irrelevant. The more unlikely the comparison, the more heartfelt it seemed. Sincerity, in this context, was measured in syllables. Subtlety was sacrificed on the altar of ornate prose. Modern scholars still debate how much of this emotional flourish was genuine and how much was performative. But what we do have, thousands of preserved letters, written in careful hand and sealed with trembling hope, proves that medieval people felt deeply, or at the very least, needed to convince someone that they did. Take, for example, the 15th century writer who opened with, "My soul is captive in your garden, like a bee stunned by the perfume of unblossomed roses." It is beautiful. It is unhinged. And it is just the beginning. Another wrote, "Without the sight of your face, my stomach curdles like milk left too long in the sun." That's devotion, or possibly digestive trouble, but either way it is vivid. And of course, the battlefield metaphor. Each time I ride into danger, I speak your name so that even my enemies might know for whom I fight and for whom I fall. Never mind the mud, the noise, the helmet, the fact that you might be knocked unconscious before you finish saying her name. The important part is the gesture, This kind of language, particularly popular in southern France and parts of northern Italy, reflected the ideals of courtly love. You were not simply confessing affection. You were engaging in a kind of chivalric theater, where longing became legend, and words were as sharp as any sword. And while men wrote plenty, women wrote back, frequently with more elegance and often with more bite. Some noblewomen were well versed in poetry and rhetoric. They responded with wit as sharp as a needle. One famously retorted, "If your love were as steadfast as your metaphors are clumsy, perhaps I would consider your suit." That stings across 7 centuries. These weren't necessarily private letters. They often passed through messengers, friends, servants, professional go-betweens who might carry not only the page but a practiced line to deliver alongside it. Imagine entrusting your innermost feelings to a man named Bernard who also runs errands for the monastery and sometimes forgets which message goes to whom. That's not just communication. That's faith. Delivery was sometimes theatrical. Letters were slipped into hymnals, sewn into pockets, buried beneath apples, or hidden inside the folds of a cloak. In one well-documented case from 1373, a baker's apprentice was arrested after a bundle of love notes was found beneath the crusts of pies bound for a local nunnery. The apprentice claimed innocence. Records suggest the nun had initiated the correspondence, but crafting the letter was not complete with words alone. Presentation mattered. Fragrance mattered. A proper love letter was often dusted lightly with crushed rose petals, tucked with a sachet of lavender or thyme, or, for the truly extravagant, dabbed with ambergris, a rare and strangely sweet-smelling substance that came from the digestive system of whales and cost more than most houses. It was considered exquisite. It was also considered suspiciously fishy. Sealing the letter added another layer of strategy. A noble's crest in wax announced identity with pride. But if the message was secret, the seal might be anonymous, or imitated. Some letters included trinkets, a tiny charm, a ring, a lock of hair, or a pressed flower flattened so neatly between the pages that you can still see its ghost hundreds of years later. Naturally, such passion was not without peril. Letters went astray. One unfortunate nobleman famously sent the wrong note to the wrong lady. His mistress received the letter meant for his wife, and vice versa. The resulting scandal ended with his exile for unfit communications. Another clumsy knight accidentally courted 2 sisters at once by confusing their names. According to the footnotes, both entered the same convent shortly thereafter. That is what historians call a resolution. The church was not pleased by any of it. Clerics denounced such letters as dangerous distractions, calling them lust of the parchment and warning that too much writing about longing might lead to damnation. During Lent, especially, romantic correspondence was frowned upon. But people continued to write. Because when your body is confined by corsets, your time is ruled by bells, and your life is boxed in by family alliances, your words are often the only place your soul can stretch its wings. Some letters weren't even sent. They were written just to exist. To turn longing into ink. To organize the ache. To preserve something that could not be said aloud. In that way, they were less letters and more prayers. Part confession. Part poem, part diary. They just happened to smell nicer and avoid emojis, and now, you sit hunched beside the candle's low glow. Your hand aches slightly from holding the quill too tight. The ink is beginning to pool near the edge. You breathe in the rain-soaked air seeping in through the wooden frame, and you begin. You write about stars you cannot see, constellations you pretend to understand. You write about their eyes, although you have only caught brief glances across feast tables and corridors. You compare your love to a hawk circling above a battlefield, to a ship lost in a fog of yearning, to a wounded falcon trying to fly. You pause. You reconsider the falcon metaphor. Then you leave it in. It's still better than the one about cheese curdling. You do not sign your name. That would be reckless. Instead, you sign off with something soft and ambiguous. your humble watcher. Or he who waits in silence. You take a drop of rosewater and touch it to the edge of the parchment with careful reverence. Will they read it? Will they laugh? Will they press it to their chest, or forget it on a windowsill? You don't know. You never do. You fold the page. You seal it. You hand it to Bernard and whisper a warning not to drop it in the soup like last time, and then you wait, because love, in every century, is equal parts longing, faith, and very poor timing. And medieval romance, especially the kind written by candlelight, depends on the hope that your words can go where you cannot. You're standing outside a bedroom. But it's not your bedroom. That would be far too simple. No, this one is draped in garlands of fragrant herbs and fresh petals, the floor scattered with blooms meant to bless the threshold. Servants bustle nearby with knowing glances and overly hushed voices. The air carries the scent of lavender water and tension. Because this chamber is not just for sleeping. It is being prepared for one of the most delicate, awkward, and overanalyzed traditions in medieval society, the proof of consummation. Tonight's romance, it turns out, involves sheets. And not for sleeping under. In many regions across medieval Europe, particularly among the nobility and the upper ranks of society, marriage was not considered truly complete until it had been consummated. And not just privately. It had to be proven, witnessed, and in some cases, displayed. Families were not merely invested in the emotional happiness of the bride and groom. They were invested in lineage, alliance, property, and honor. And so, incredibly, there were occasions when trusted witnesses waited just outside the couple's chamber, listening intently for the unmistakable signs of fulfillment. Not the soft strumming of a lute or the gentle creak of a bed frame. No. They listened for movement. For voices. For anything that might suggest that two people inside had officially sealed the bond. You may have heard the term bedding ceremony. Rest assured, it was not just symbolic. Sometimes the couple was physically led to the bed by a jubilant parade of guests, showered with flowers, sung to, toasted with wine. In other cases, the moment came with less fanfare but more embarrassment. Parents and elders might offer advice, some practical, some intrusive, most uninvited. One 14th-century French noblewoman was reportedly handed a slim, leather-bound booklet just before entering the bedchamber. It bore the title How to Warm the Lord's Loins. The contents are lost to history. The discomfort, however, is not hard to imagine, and the ritual continued the next morning. In certain households, especially when the marriage involved important property or political stakes, the morning after came with a moment of spectacle, or at least proof. This meant producing the bed sheets, specifically the portion stained with blood, and displaying it for family members, household staff, or in some cases, clerical observers. It was evidence. A visual confirmation that the bride had entered the marriage a virgin, and that the union had been fully, physically sealed. The sheet might be held up, laid across a bench, or passed around discreetly. One account from a Burgundian manor describes a grandmother who embroidered a border around the stained portion and kept it for posterity. Nothing says family pride like preserved linen. Of course, historians continue to debate the true frequency of this practice. Was it widespread? Or limited to particularly performative courts, such as those in Castile or Burgundy, where every gesture became ceremony? The truth is probably somewhere in between. But we have poems, court records, and even parodies that confirm it was common enough to be mocked. One biting satirical tale from the 15th century tells of a young husband who, lacking the expected mark on the sheet, bribed his squire to stage a dramatic nosebleed. The stain was sufficient. The deception, it seems, was never discovered. Among the peasantry, things were looser. But not by much. Weddings were community affairs, and the community expected participation. It was not unusual for the village to accompany the couple to their home with drums, torches, crude jokes, and even livestock. Some customs included pounding on the newlywed's door throughout the night or scattering grain across the threshold to encourage fertility. In smaller hamlets, privacy was a luxury few could afford, and romance was always slightly communal. If all of this sounds mortifying, that's because it was. And the stakes were high. If the sheet came back unstained, consequences ranged from awkward whispers to devastating scandal. A bride might be accused of impurity, deceit, or even sorcery. A groom could be mocked for his lack of manly vigor. One famously unfortunate knight, upon failing to perform, blamed the heavy venison stew served at the wedding feast. The excuse was quickly seized upon by jesters, and songs about Sir Venison circulated at court for weeks, but as with many medieval customs, the ritual was about more than just sex. It was about evidence. The blood on the sheet was not just bodily. It was political, legal, and symbolic. It confirmed that alliances had been honored, that inheritances were protected, and that public trust was intact. Love may have fluttered at the edges, but linen carried the verdict. In certain regions, particularly in Italy and Eastern Europe, the importance of the stain was such that brides were quietly taught how to ensure its appearance. If nature did not provide, a carefully hidden pouch of chicken blood or beetroot dye might. A small pinprick to the finger could suffice. Rumors suggest that entire markets existed where bridesmaids might purchase pre-blooded linens or staining kits, sold discreetly alongside perfumes and lace. When virginity is currency, ingenuity becomes necessity. And the obsession did not stop there. Before the wedding, noble brides might be subjected to physical examinations by midwives or senior female relatives to confirm their purity. These so-called tests were based on outdated beliefs and poor science, but they carried the full weight of tradition. Entire manuals were written to instruct women on how to appear modest, untouched, and blushing. A maiden, one 12th century text warned, should never walk with a strong step or speak with too much humor. She should glide, silently, like a spirit passing between worlds. One who laughed too loudly or danced too freely might be suspected of unsanctioned experience. Men, on the other hand, were not subjected to the same pre-wedding scrutiny. But after the vows were exchanged, they too faced performance pressure. A groom who failed to perform on the wedding night risked humiliation, annulment, and legal inquiry, especially if the bride's family held power. In rare and particularly harrowing cases, church courts demanded physical proof of virility. One such trial in 15th century France involved a nobleman required to demonstrate his ability in front of a panel of witnesses, including a physician and 2 court scribes. Their notes survive. They are anatomical, joyless, and disturbingly precise. Not every marriage faced such scrutiny. Among common folk, love and union could be more flexible. If 2 people lived together, shared labor, and presented themselves as husband and wife, the community often accepted the bond. Yet even here, consummation was the seal. Without it, words remained hollow and partnerships unblessed. The obsession even made its way into religious lore. One miracle tale from a 14th century abbey tells of a groom who found himself unable to consummate his marriage due to an invisible presence sitting at the foot of the bed. After prayer and a generous dousing of holy water, the presence left. The couple, the story claims, lived happily and fruitfully thereafter. No mention is made of the sheets, and then there's the bridal garter. In some households, the morning after featured a ritual where the groom removed the bride's garter and presented it to the assembled guests like a medal of honor. In more raucous settings, it was passed around the feasting table like a trophy, held up in toasts, sometimes even kissed. The implications were never subtle, which leads to the inevitable question, did anyone, ever, get privacy? Occasionally. A few couples, especially those of high rank or unusual stubbornness, refused the spectacle. One royal pair in Hungary famously locked their chamber door against the servants, guards, and clergymen assigned to observe. They emerged the next morning with tousled hair and tired eyes, declaring, "Our bond is forged in silence." Their families were scandalized. But their marriage endured for decades, and now here you are, picturing yourself in that perfumed, overheated room. Your heart thudding as you listen to the shuffling footsteps outside. You glance at the linen, its whiteness suddenly accusatory. The door feels thinner than it should. Every creak is a breath held in judgment. Every candle flicker is a spectator's sigh. Medieval romance, you realize, was not just difficult. It was supervised. It was documented. It was stained with politics and embroidered with obligation, and yet, despite the spectacle, the pressure, and the scrutiny, some couples managed something real. You can see it in the letters they wrote, in the songs they passed hand to hand, in the way their names reappear, quietly, lovingly, in prayers and bequests. You can feel it in the pauses during Massachusetts. In the glances held too long across banquet tables. In the way hands found each other beneath linen, so you take a breath. You look at the sheets. You steady your thoughts, and in that moment, you pray, for peace, for kindness, and for the small, impossible miracle that everyone else in the household decides to go to sleep early and, for once, mind their own business. You're walking through the narrow cloisters of a chapel. Not because you're particularly devout, although keeping up appearances of piety does help your reputation. No, you're here because not long ago, you brushed shoulders with someone in the market courtyard. And now, depending on the interpretation of church law, you might be married. Congratulations. Maybe, in the tangled thicket of medieval canon law, few things are more bewildering than just how easily, unexpectedly, and sometimes absurdly two people could find themselves legally and spiritually wed. A glance that lingered too long. A hand resting, perhaps a beat too deliberately, on a sleeve. The sharing of a meal beneath a certain kind of tree at a certain kind of hour. It sounds ridiculous, perhaps even theatrical. But these small moments carried serious weight. Because in the eyes of the medieval church, it was not the ceremony or the presence of a priest that made a marriage. It was consent. Mutual, conscious, and declared. That was the foundation. And everything else was formality, which leads us to one of the strangest and most paradoxical pieces of medieval dating advice ever given: be very, very careful how you touch someone. Or speak to them. Or stand too close. Because with the wrong combination of body language, proximity, and unintentional sincerity, you might find yourself saddled with a spouse. The Church's legal foundation on marriage was built on the principle of intention. If two individuals expressed their consent to marry one another, spoken clearly, directly, and earnestly, then the bond was considered valid in the eyes of God. Whether that declaration was made in front of dozens of witnesses or whispered alone under a fig tree, the sacrament took root. No officiant required. No exchange of rings. No elaborate feast or ceremonial blessings. Just words. One moment of intention, and you were spiritually bound. Scholars and canon lawyers debated the nuances endlessly. Did consummation need to follow for the marriage to be fully recognized? Was verbal consent alone enough, or did it require documentation, witness testimony, or a divine spark of sincerity? These questions became the basis of countless court cases and theological disputes. But one thing is clear: a great many people walked around unsure whether they were betrothed, married, or simply very unlucky. This led to situations that were both dramatic and surreal. A couple might insist they had been merely courting, exchanging polite pleasantries and nothing more. But if one of them had, in the heat of the moment, let slip a phrase like "I take thee as my own," the consequences could be swift and irreversible. A bishop might summon them for questioning. Clerics might be assigned to investigate the precise phrasing, the time of day, the placement of hands. Canon law became something of a spiritual detective agency, parsing through the difference between flirtation and contract. Every word mattered. Every gesture had weight. The most infamous phrase, I plight thee my troth. It sounds poetic now, like something embroidered on a tapestry. But in the medieval context, it was no joke. Spoken with intention and clarity, especially during physical touch, it became a legally binding declaration. A vow. A promise before God. Say it at the wrong moment, and you could find yourself suddenly yoked to someone for life. This is why, among nobility and cautious households, advisors often warn their young charges against even the most seemingly innocent forms of affection. No hand-holding. No lingering glances. No helping someone mount a horse or lift a veil. It was too dangerous. Affection was a slippery slope. And sometimes, that slope ended in holy matrimony, and sleeves, oh, sleeves were treacherous territory. In the world of courtly love, sleeves held layers of meaning. To offer someone your sleeve to kiss was a subtle, chivalric invitation. But to touch the inside of someone's sleeve, particularly uninvited, was far more suggestive. It was intimate, even presumptive. A troubadour's ballad tells the tale of a knight who, during a spring dance, brushed the embroidered cuff of a noblewoman's gown. Her brother, watching closely, declared the gesture a claim on her body. The incident ended not with apologies but with drawn swords and a formal duel at dawn. The sleeve, it turns out, was sacred ground, yet despite the risks, some lovers saw opportunity in the chaos, if you were a bold suitor of lower rank and longed for someone far above your station. These loopholes in canon law could be used to your advantage. A whispered vow at the right moment. A staged interaction near a chapel or during a festival. A gentle touch paired with the correct phrase. It was not unheard of for suitors to trap a noble in marriage by technicality. Consent, after all, was the law's anchor. And words, once spoken sincerely, had weight. Of course, not every ploy ended in celebration. Some hopeful lovers were rewarded with heartbreak. Others received a blade to the ribs. The road to clandestine matrimony was narrow and strewn with peril. As confusion mounted, the Church took steps to restore order. The Fourth Lateran Council, convened in 1215, sought to formalize the marriage process. Decrees were issued that required weddings to be public and solemn. Bans, announcements of intent, were to be read aloud in the local parish across 3 Sundays, giving the community time to object. But even with these reforms, private promises continued. People still made hasty vows, sometimes in haylofts, sometimes in kitchens, and occasionally while drunk on honeyed mead at a harvest festival. One record from 14th century Norwich tells of a couple who accidentally married during a play rehearsal. Their lines included a marriage vow, and they spoke them with such fervor that a priest watching from the crowd stood and proclaimed the marriage valid. The actors, understandably, were startled. The priest retired shortly after the incident, perhaps regretting his spontaneity, and there is the tale, recounted in more than one chronicle, of a man and woman caught in a sudden rainstorm. They ducked beneath a shared cloak and joked that it was like being husband and wife. Unfortunately, someone overheard. Later, when the woman became pregnant, the man denied any connection. But the bishop reminded him of the cloak, the remark, and the laughter. That was enough. A public vow. A shared covering. A marriage, even sharing a bed, was a gamble. Some communities practiced a custom known as bundling, allowing young couples to sleep in the same bed, sometimes separated by a wooden plank, sometimes bound in their clothing. It was meant to foster intimacy without scandal. But if a neighbor saw, and if anyone whispered something that resembled a promise, the court of public opinion might declare the couple wed before morning. Gossip, it turns out, was as binding as scripture. In an effort to gain some control over all this ambiguity, some couples turned to written contracts. Short, often hastily penned. These love pledges were exchanged in private but witnessed by a trusted friend or servant. One document from 1328 survives, where a young man scrawled, "I do take Joan as my lawful wife, though my mother doth protest. It is signed, dated, and smudged with what appears to be ink and regret. Family drama, it seems, is eternal, but for women in particular, the stakes were much higher. Ambiguous marriage could mean social ruin. If a man claimed to have wed a woman privately and then disappeared, she might find herself deemed unchaste, unmarriageable, and legally stranded. Even if nothing had happened, the mere suggestion could stain her reputation. This is why many noblewomen insisted on public ceremonies, witnessed by as many eyes as possible. Even if they had already whispered their vows in secret, they needed the theater of marriage to protect their futures. The law tried to keep pace, but courts across Europe were overwhelmed with marriage disputes. Cases hinged on who said what, when, and how sincerely. One particularly strange trial involved a girl accused of marrying her suitor during a game. She insisted she had been joking. He insisted he had taken her at her word. The judges reviewed testimonies. They examined gestures. They debated tone. In the end, the ruling came down to interpretation. The verdict? Her laughter had been flirtatious, not satirical. They were married. You, meanwhile, are now retracing your steps through the cloisters, mentally reviewing every interaction you've had with the baker's daughter over the last month. Did you hold her gaze too long? Did you allow her to touch your sleeve more than once? Did you share that fig beneath the old elm tree while quoting a psalm about love and devotion? You hope not. You sincerely hope not, because in this world, romance is not so much about falling in love. It is about navigating an invisible legal labyrinth, one stitched with lace, tangled in Latin, and governed by metaphors about sleeves, bread, and hand placement, so as you step out into the sunlight and leave the chapel behind, you keep your hands carefully at your sides. You nod politely at the passers-by. You make sure to compliment someone's falcon instead of their face. And when someone offers you a smile that feels too warm, too lingering, too filled with possibility, you lower your gaze and study the floor with sudden, intense interest, just in case. You're at a festival now, somewhere between the warmth of midsummer and the gentle drizzle that often signals the feast of Saint Swithin. The air is thick with the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts, crushed thyme underfoot, smoke from peat fires, and something unidentifiably sticky that clings to your shoes. Children dart through the crowd with garlands in their hair. Jugglers juggle flaming torches dangerously close to the linen sleeves of nervous onlookers. A man in a feathered hat is enthusiastically, and very badly, singing a song about St. George's lost slipper. And tucked in the shadowy corner of the green, near the stall with jars of honey and a woman wearing a beekeeper's veil, is someone offering to read your stars. Just one coin, you agree. Not because you believe in it, necessarily, but because you've run out of decent flirting ideas, and this seems safer than another attempt at poetry. Welcome to the peculiar, elaborate intersection of astrology and romance, medieval style. A world where the movement of stars was more than poetic imagery. It was science, guidance, matchmaking strategy, and occasionally, a fully accepted excuse for every romantic mishap you've ever had. You sit on a stool that creaks ominously. The astrologer, draped in layers of blue and smelling faintly of cloves and old ink, waves a trail of incense over your head while muttering something that might be Latin. She unrolls a stained parchment chart filled with celestial scribbles. She asks for your date of birth. You pause. You're not sure. She squints suspiciously. You blurt out a date that sounds plausible. She nods solemnly. Evidently, that's good enough. Today, astrology divides opinion. Some treat it as superstition. Others, as spiritual insight. But in medieval Europe, astrology was respected as serious, scholarly work. It was studied at universities, practiced at royal courts, and consulted before launching battles, planting wheat, or choosing a baby's name. Kings had official court astrologers on salary, often before hiring a full-time physician. These stargazers weren't entertainers. They were advisors, analysts, and sometimes, scapegoats. There is still debate among historians about how deeply astrology reached into everyday lives. Did farmers genuinely avoid planting barley during a waning moon, or was that a nobleman's concern? Did villagers plan their weddings around Jupiter's cycle? Or only cite the stars when things went wrong? What is clear is that medieval manuscripts, everything from medical texts to love poems, are crowded with references to planetary logic and celestial influence. Here's how the system worked. In practice, your zodiac sign, known then as your natal sign, was believed to govern your nature. It shaped your virtues, your flaws, your appetites, and your destiny. Were you born under Leo? Then you were said to be bold, fiery, proud, and likely inclined to dramatic gestures involving roses and declarations. Virgo? Chaste, orderly, critical, with a strong preference for neat handwriting and well-raked fields. Sagittarius? Restless, philosophical. Always ready to fall in love with someone and then leave on a pilgrimage 2 weeks later, and that was just the beginning. Astrology dictated romantic compatibility. If you wished to know whether your affection for the merchant's flaxen-haired daughter was fated or foolish, you consulted the sun signs. If they were harmonious, good. If they clashed, you lit a candle, avoided eye contact, and hoped for better planetary odds next month. Astrologers calculated the motion of 7 major celestial bodies: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each had a personality. Each influenced different parts of your life. Venus, naturally, ruled romance, beauty, and desire. If Venus was ascending in your birth chart, it meant you were likely to be charismatic, alluring, and gifted with a pleasing singing voice. If Venus was in decline, it meant you might be unlucky in love, prone to awkward stumbles, or, perhaps, cursed to always spill wine on your sleeve at the worst possible moment. One court astrologer from the 14th century famously advised that a man born with Venus in Libra and Mars in Aries should avoid red-haired women during Lent, or else suffer a complete loss of romantic interest and develop a strange craving for onions. This advice survives in 3 separate manuscripts, which suggests that someone took it very seriously. The moon cycles added yet another layer of complexity. A waning moon was considered inauspicious for beginning anything romantic. A waxing moon, particularly a crescent, was thought to be ideal for starting new affections, sending secret letters, or reciting poetry beneath a window. A full moon in Scorpio, while Mars opposed Saturn, was the astrological equivalent of walking directly into heartbreak and then writing a sonnet about it while crying into your soup. Some marriage contracts from the late 1300s even included astrological clauses. One noble wedding was explicitly postponed because the stars were deemed inhospitable that week. Another contract specified that the ceremony must not take place under the influence of Saturn, widely feared as a celestial killjoy. In these cases, the stars did not merely advise. They dictated. Astrology also served as a defense mechanism for the lovelorn. Were you rejected by the charming cheese seller's son? Mercury was likely in retrograde. Did your sweetheart vanish without explanation, leaving behind only a carved spoon and a vague note about personal growth? Surely, their Venus was combust, or perhaps your Mars was afflicted. You were not heartbroken. Merely misaligned. The astrologers themselves dispensed not only predictions but advice. If your chart showed emotional imbalance, you might be told to wear specific colors: green for harmony, blue for honesty, yellow for clarity. They might instruct you to eat or avoid certain foods. Figs to moderate lust. Fennel to encourage verbal expression. Too many leaks. A guaranteed argument. Payment for this wisdom was flexible. Coins were welcomed, but so were chickens, salted fish, or a well-dried sprig of rosemary. The medieval heart, it seems, could be guided by both the stars and soup ingredients. Some took astrology to its fullest extent. Ambitious lovers requested synastry charts, complex comparisons between two birth charts to determine not only compatibility but also the likelihood of surviving the winter together without stabbing each other over firewood. If the stars matched, your love was said to resonate like a harp in harmony. If they clashed, you might be advised to remain friends. Or pursue a life of prayer and embroidery. One oft-told story recounts a noblewoman in Wales who fell deeply for a traveling minstrel. She insisted that they could not wed until the astrologer identified their harmonic day of coupling. That day, after much calculation, was found to be 12 years away. They waited. They married. They divorced 6 months later. Venus, apparently, has a sense of irony. Astrological belief even made its way into wardrobes. Some wore small talismans engraved with their zodiac symbol, hoping it would enhance their natural charm or protect them from heartbreak. Others wore stones aligned with their planetary rulers. A Sagittarius might carry a sliver of turquoise. A Cancer, a pearl set in silver. Some truly dedicated believers stitched entire constellations into their clothing, walking around draped in the sky itself. This was considered both romantic and, depending on the moon phase, very risky, but not everyone approved. The church viewed astrology with caution. It did not forbid it outright, but drew stern distinctions. Natural astrology, used to predict tides or aid physicians, was permitted. Judicial astrology, used to foretell love, fortune, and death, was much more controversial. Theologians debated whether stars could influence free will. Some scholars defended it. Others condemned it as bordering on heresy. Occasionally, an astrologer's charts were confiscated or, in extreme cases, publicly burned. But as long as people fell in love, astrology found a way to survive. It crept into daily life. A bishop's niece might tuck a birth chart beneath her mattress and consult it before each feast. A shepherd might delay giving his sweetheart a carved token because Jupiter was in poor humor. A merchant might postpone his proposal until the next full moon, citing planetary interference. And in every town, from bustling cities to sleepy hamlets, there was someone with ink-stained fingers and a deep opinion about your rising sign. You, sitting now in front of the feather-hatted astrologer, listen as she informs you that your Venus is exalted, your Mars is lethargic, and your Saturn has been holding an old grudge since the year 1326. You are advised to wear yellow silk when you next visit the marketplace, to avoid anyone with a goat, and to speak your heart before the next full moon or risk a season of unspoken regret. You nod. You drop your coin into her palm. You rise and walk away, the scent of incense still clinging to your sleeves and a curious sense of clarity blooming in your chest, because love in the Middle Ages was never just about poems or perfumed letters. It was about destiny. It was about celestial choreography. Every glance, every touch, every sigh might already be written somewhere in the stars. And maybe, even now, some part of that still feels true. It is late now. The kind of late that presses gently against the world, soft and certain, when the moon casts its silver gaze through the narrow slats of wooden shutters, and long pale ribbons of light spill across cobbled lanes and packed earth courtyards like silk unraveling. The village has quieted almost completely. Hearths have burned low in their stone mouths, red embers pulsing beneath the blackened skeletons of firewood. That last breath of warmth flickers quietly in dark rooms, glowing faintly like weary hearts still beating in their sleep. From a handful of chimneys, smoke still rises, curling lazily into a sky dusted with stars so sharp and clear it seems the heavens have opened wider just for this hour. The air is still, yet it listens. You feel it. Around you, the hush has descended fully. Not a lifeless hush, but a living one. It is the kind of silence where every creak of a floorboard, every shift of timber, every owl's distant cry or fox's step in dry leaves seems magnified. Each noise becomes meaningful. Every sound carries weight. Yet within that vast quiet, you remain awake, because this hour, belongs to something else entirely. This is the hour when everything hidden begins to stir. When words, those fragile, trembling things, slip free from the bonds of daylight and take flight like breath across the cool air. When promises half-formed and hopes barely spoken drift gently through the stillness like pollen in spring. This is when hearts, otherwise shielded by reason and rules, dare to edge forward into risk. When shadows grow long enough to shelter longing, and the world offers a fleeting sliver of permission to try. This is the hour of a particular magic. The most delicately reckless ritual of medieval romance, the nighttime window whisper. Forget the grand spectacles of courtly love, where noblemen recited carefully memorized lines in candlelit halls while minstrels strummed lutes nearby. Forget the embroidered gloves exchanged across feast tables or the orchestrated waltz of status during court dances. For those without noble blood, without influence or inheritance, true feelings had no official stage. They had to seek their chance elsewhere. So they crept into the shadows. They climbed up the ivy. They waited in the hedges. A girl might lean from a narrow window, cheeks still warm from dreams. A boy might wait below, cloaked by moonlight, breath held tight. And between them passed words so quick, so hushed, they might have been imagined. But make no mistake. This was no light-hearted game, in a world where virtue was guarded more fiercely than coin, where the honor of a girl could be shattered by a single mistimed laugh or glance, and where eyes watched from windows and doorways with the sharpness of hawks, slipping off to speak sweet nothings beneath a shuttered window was not charming. It was dangerous. Reckless. One wrong moment, a dog barking, a shutter swinging open, a floorboard groaning beneath a sleepless parent's foot, and everything could change. Reputations could splinter. Futures could be stolen, and yet, they came anyway. Night after night. Village after village. Through bramble and bracken, through whispering wheat fields and the ruins of curfews. Love climbed where doors remained locked. It scaled stone and wood and fear itself. It waited beneath windows because nowhere else would let it speak. Historians still argue how common the practice truly was. Was it a ritual romanticized in poems and folk songs, more legend than life? Or was it a nightly event, hidden in plain sight, known by every village girl who kept her ears tuned and every boy who learned which step creaked outside the wrong house? The answer, like so many things about the past, lies somewhere between. There are traces. Glimpses in trial records. Allusions in love songs. Complaints from weary guards and household staff who had seen and heard far too much. The ritual itself required very little. Simplicity was part of its charm. Usually, it was the boy, or the man, or the foolishly hopeful apprentice, who ventured out. He wrapped himself in his warmest tunic, hood pulled low to protect both warmth and identity, and made his way through silent lanes or across dew-damp fields to stand beneath the chosen window. Perhaps he carried a lute, if he fancied himself musical. A recorder, if he lacked self-awareness. More often, just his voice, trembling with cold and courage, he might whisper her name, softly at first. Or say the pet name known only to them. Or recite a line from a poem borrowed or half-remembered. "O star of my morning," he might say. Or, if less gifted with words, "Your hair is like fire, but soft." Romantic grammar was negotiable, if she was awake, and if her heart stirred in reply. She might respond, not always with speech. A shift of the curtain. A soft breath against glass. A whispered go-away delivered in a tone that did not mean it. A flower dropped lightly from the window. A ribbon loosened and sent drifting. These were signals, rich with hidden meaning. Each act its own coded response. A single bloom meant interest. A piece of cloth might mean promise. A chamber pot emptied too suddenly. That one was not up for misinterpretation. This wasn't a pursuit reserved for nobles. These whispered moments belonged to stable boys and blacksmith sons, to girls with roughened palms and laughter like bright bells. The night was their loophole. A time outside the rules, beyond the reach of arranged matches and suspicious elders. A time when love could slip its fingers between the cracks of control. Still, it came at a price. Sometimes, watchers waited. Fathers with cudgels. Brothers with sharp ears. A case in one Flemish village tells of a miller's daughter courted one too many times beneath the window. Her father caught the boy, thrashed him with a broom, then marched him to the chapel. The wedding happened the next day. The groom smiled through a split lip. Other stories took stranger turns. One boy, misjudging his aim, sang a passionate ballad beneath what he thought was his sweetheart's window. When the shutter creaked open, it revealed her grandmother, wrapped in a shawl, blinking down at him. She clapped politely. They later married. Romance, evidently, is flexible. Sometimes the encounters resembled small plays. A boy stacking barrels into a teetering tower. A girl leaning so far from her window she nearly tumbled out. Or the case of a baker's apprentice who hurled oranges at his lover's window while shouting, "Your sweetness rots me." He was later arrested. The crime? Disturbing the peace with produce. Some lovers abandoned voices altogether. Instead, they used signs. A candle in the window meant yes. 2 candles meant not yet. 3 meant her mother was still in the room, knitting furiously and refusing to leave. There were codes like this everywhere. Glances exchanged at the well. Ribbons tied to doorknobs. A dropped handkerchief folded a certain way. In a world where being overheard could spell ruin, lovers became spies, and love became a game of quiet signals. Letters passed in secret, too. Messages dropped in water pails. Lines tucked into bread loaves. Notes embroidered into sleeves or hidden in the folds of cloaks. One girl even passed her feelings by hiding a message inside the wool of a sheep meant for market. Unfortunately, the message was read only after the sheep had been shorn and sold. The romance was delayed, but not entirely lost, and not every tale ended happily. In Florence, a merchant's daughter whispered each night to a suitor who claimed noble blood. He quoted Virgil, wore silks, and knew just when to sigh. But he was, in truth, a tailor's apprentice, borrowing his master's best hat and phrases. His downfall came when he recited her father's invoice instead of a love poem. She fled to Milan. He stayed behind, wiser and hatless. So why did they risk it? Why brave the night for whispers? Because beneath those shutters, behind those flickering candles, was something that could not be found in contracts or family agreements. There, stripped of pretense and performance, love became raw. Real. It became something 2 people created with nothing more than breath, daring, and desire. Not for titles or status. Not for dowry or duty. But simply for the thrill of knowing someone had come only for you. It was the hope of being awaited. The knowledge that someone braved cold stones and 1,000 risks just to speak your name. To share a single breath of closeness. A word not approved. A truth not recorded, even the songs of the time knew. They spoke of midnight vows. Of names whispered to stone. Of meetings that never went further than a glance, a word, a shared sky. In one Breton legend, a girl died waiting for a voice to return. Her ghost still watches from her window, listening for footsteps that never came. And now, here you are. Beneath the window. You have brought no instrument. No fruit. Only your voice. And in your hand, a small ribbon. Blue. Faintly scented with thyme. The same sprig she tucked behind your belt last spring. Laughing, you whisper her name. Gently. Once, then again, nothing. Then, movement. A curtain flutters. A sliver of lamplight appears, then disappears. Fingers brush softly across the frame. That is all, but it is enough. because here, in this world of guarded daughters and loud bells, of silent codes and candlelight, of breath held beneath the stars, you have done something brave. You have created something that no one else owns. A moment unspoken but understood. A tenderness shared across darkness, a secret. A softness. A kind of love, and in this strange, structured, rule-bound world, sometimes, that was the only freedom that mattered. You are standing in a barn, not because you wandered in by mistake, and certainly not by preference. You have been invited here, although summoned might be a more accurate term. And no, this is not the beginning of a romantic tryst behind a haystack. There will be no stolen kisses beneath the moonlight, no breathless declarations of love, no sonnets borrowed from troubadours whispered in the dark. You are not here to exchange longing glances or slip a secret note into a sleeve. You are here for one reason only: someone has looked at your face, considered your name, taken stock of your family's holdings, examined your future prospects, and come to the tentative conclusion that you may, in fact, be a viable candidate for marriage. But before anything official can be said, before the dowry is negotiated, before the family names are compared, before lineage or land or bloodlines come into it, there is one more step: they would like to smell your armpits. Yes. Your armpits. Welcome to one of the most bewildering, bodily, and surprisingly formal customs in the odd tapestry of medieval matchmaking, the olfactory test. In an era without deodorant, without dry shampoo, without cologne or eau de anything, and in a time when even the most basic soap was a luxury, your scent was not just a background detail. It was front and center. It was observed, interpreted, whispered about, sometimes even admired. Your scent was not merely about attraction. It was a statement. It was a signal. It was medical. It was mystical. It told a story about your health, your habits, your emotional state, your future. In a time when baths were rare, laundry less so but still sporadic, and perfume a treasure reserved for those far above the common class, the aroma of your body was believed to speak volumes. It was sweat as biography. And so, here you are, inside a barn with open beams above and a thick layer of straw scattered beneath your feet. The scent of hay mixes with animal musk and wood smoke from a nearby hearth. Somewhere behind you, a cow shifts lazily. Around you, people are watching. Not to see how you stand or speak, not to assess your manners or your knowledge of courtly dance, but to gauge your personal scent. Let us try to understand this peculiar practice, as delicately as possible. Medieval medicine operated on a theory of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were believed to control not only your health, but your personality, your temperament, and your balance with the world. Each humor was associated with elements, seasons, emotions, and yes, odors. An imbalance might reveal itself not just in mood or complexion, but in scent. A sourness in your breath, a dampness in your skin, or a lingering sharpness in the air around you might be taken as proof of internal chaos. Not ideal. When someone is considering you as a future spouse, historians still debate how widespread these olfactory customs were. Were they common occurrences in every village, or strange regional quirks that were written down precisely because of how odd they seemed? The truth appears to lie somewhere in between. While not every village held formal sniffing sessions, enough letters, folk manuals, household records, and even legal testimonies survived to suggest that scent played a real and sometimes pivotal role in the process of courtship, especially in rural, tradition-bound regions. In medieval Poland, in corners of Wales, and among clans in the Scottish Highlands, there are documented accounts of what were sometimes called smelling sessions. These events were not necessarily public, but they were very real. A young woman might be asked to handle a suitor's cloak or sit with his tunic draped across her lap. Her response, emotional, physical, even spiritual, was carefully considered. If she felt content, calm, or subtly drawn in, that was a promising sign. But if her stomach turned, her head began to ache, or a sudden heaviness settled on her chest, it was often interpreted as a bad omen. In one letter from 15th century Germany, a mother cautions her daughter in no uncertain terms, avoid the miller's boy. For his neck linen carries the smell of bitter onions and haste. Whether the complaint was about poor hygiene, bad temperament, or simply a life lived in too much of a rush, the message is unmistakable, and the practice did not stop with disapproval. Certain scents were actively admired. They were seen as signs of health and goodness. A proper man, especially one of working stock, was expected to carry the scent of physical labor. A Welsh folk song puts it clearly, a true man smells of wood smoke, salt wind, and leather dried by sun. It sounds less like a medical observation and more like the advertising copy for a cologne you might find today. But it was serious, women were no less scrutinized. A virtuous woman, it was believed, should carry the gentle aromas of the herbs she used in her cooking or her washing. Warm bread. Sweet lavender. Chamomile, perhaps. These scents could be natural, or they could be enhanced by the careful use of sachets tucked into sleeves and bodices. Rosemary sewn into the hems of gowns. Sage rubbed through combs. Mint tucked beneath the tongue. But if a woman carried the scent of vinegar, damp wool, or stagnant air, she might be marked as melancholic or, worse, quarrelsome. And none of this could truly be hidden once people got close. And closeness, in matchmaking, was often inevitable. One custom involved leading two prospective partners into a small, enclosed space, a pantry, a livestock stall, or most often, a barn. They were told they would have a chance to speak privately. In truth, they were being offered a chance to take each other in. The voice. The posture. The scent. Small talk was encouraged. A few polite questions. But the real conversation happened in the nose. Outside, parents waited. The matchmaker took mental notes. In one account from a Flemish village, a girl fainted mid-sentence, later claiming the breath of the brewer's apprentice was like fish left too long in a damp sack. The engagement was cancelled before she recovered. There were quieter rituals, too. In some places, a woman was given a man's glove or hat to keep with her for a day. She would carry it while tending her chores, sensing how it made her feel. If no illness or emotional turmoil appeared, the match might proceed. But if she fell sick, or felt sadness for no cause, it was interpreted as a sign, something was wrong with the match. And then, of course, there was the armpit cloth. This was the most direct test of all. A strip of linen, placed beneath the arm of a suitor and worn through hours of work, stress, or sweat. When the cloth was steeped enough in his scent, it was removed, folded, and handed to the woman being considered. She would sniff it, quietly, carefully, and her reaction would carry weight. More than a conversation. More than a recommendation. This was sent as fate. One tale from Brittany tells of a noblewoman who declined a politically powerful match, citing the cloth he sent. It smelled of war and widowhood, she said. He married another. The story claims that wife died within a year. Whether it was prophetic instinct or gossip rewritten in hindsight, no one can say. Men also paid attention to scent, though their evaluations were more often silent. A man might note the smell of a woman's hair after a feast. The fragrance of her sleeves after a long walk. If she smelled of straw and milk, that meant warmth. If she carried a scent of tallow and ashes, it might be a sign of bitterness. Of knowing too much, all of this might sound absurd now. But in a world without toothpaste, without soap for every household, without easy ways to mask the truth, scent was intimacy. It was memory. It was the most honest part of a person, left behind even when words were forgotten. Even the love poems of the age were steeped in scent. Troubadours did not simply praise a woman's beauty. They wrote of the air around her, of the fragrance she carried. She came to me like the breath of lilac in thaw, wrote one. Her hands bore the scent of ripe apple peel. Her sighs, of violets dried in psalms. Another lamented a lost love, the scent gone from my pillow, never to return. And now, you are still here. Still in the barn, the matchmaker has stepped away, whispering to someone who might be a relative. The mother of the girl you hope to impress is watching your boots with a critical eye. A cousin nearby lifts a kerchief to her nose. You cannot tell whether it is a gesture of respect or alarm. You shift slightly. Consider the door. Wonder, briefly, how fast you can run in these shoes. And then she smiles, she looks at you, calm and thoughtful, and says you smell of beeswax and parchment. Of soft dust and something kind. You take it as a compliment, because in this strange, whispered world of medieval love, where everything from breath to boots is under scrutiny, your best quality might not be your looks, your lands, or your lineage, it might simply be the scent of your sweat. You are standing very still in a cloister garden, trying, and not with any great success, to appear deeply interested in a gooseberry bush. Its stems are bristled, the leaves sharp-edged, and the clusters of pale green fruit are tucked like secrets beneath the branches. Your hand hovers above a leaf, fingers twitching with indecision, as if you might pluck one, as if you were truly examining the plant's condition. But in truth, your thoughts are elsewhere. Far from agriculture. Far from botany, you are spying on a monk, not to question his theology. You are not here to argue over heresies or to discuss Augustine's commentary on sin. You are not even especially interested in the architecture of the abbey walls rising quietly behind you. You are here because, somehow, despite the tonsured scalp, despite the solemn vow of chastity, despite the robe of scratchy wool that rustles like repentance stitched into every seam, this monk, against all reasonable expectation, is, quite simply, dreamy. Perhaps it is the way he moves, with calm, deliberate grace, as he tends the garden beds. His hands, steady and sure, brush through sprigs of thyme, sage, and lavender, careful not to break the stems. Perhaps it is the sound of his voice, low and even, when he recites psalms at vespers, each syllable offered like a pebble dropped into still water. Perhaps it is something more dangerous still, the way his very presence, his quiet solitude. His calm detachment from the ordinary world makes him appear not cold, but luminous. Nothing burns in the heart quite like a longing that must remain unspoken. And nothing is more forbidden than a man who has already made his vows, to silence, to solitude, and most of all, to God. This is the strange, persistent ache at the heart of one of medieval love's most baffling subplots, the hopeless crush on a monk. A phenomenon that, by every rule and regulation of the time, should not have existed. And yet, persist it did. Often. Earnestly. Sometimes foolishly. Always stubbornly, let us be clear from the beginning. Monks were not meant to love. Not in the earthly, romantic sense. They were not meant to flirt or fantasize or even allow their eyes to linger too long on the silhouette of a shepherdess outlined by sunset. Their lives were meant to be defined by discipline. Prayer. Labor. Study. Their waking hours were filled with ritual and silence. Their nights with reflection and psalms. They labored by hand in cold gardens and copied sacred texts by the flicker of candlelight in rooms so cold their breath sometimes smoked above the vellum. Love, if it came at all, was to be directed upwards. Not sideways, but the human heart has a way of finding openings. It slips through cracks in even the most well-fortified walls, and ivy has never asked permission before climbing stone. The heart does not always keep the same schedule as the rule of Saint Benedict. And the imagination has never needed to ask for leave. Historians still debate how often this happened. Some orders were strict to the point of isolation. Others allowed for carefully chaperoned interaction with the outside world. But there are enough scraps of evidence, court records, love notes, sermons laced with warning, and personal testimonies whispered in confessionals, to suggest that monks were not entirely immune to affection. or to being the object of it, and it is not difficult to see why. In a world where many men were rough-handed, rough-mannered, and more interested in ale than in thought, the monk stood apart. He was gentle. He was literate. He smelled of herbs. He understood silence and the rhythm of seasons. He could sing. He spoke softly. He walked slowly. He seemed safe. Except he was not, because he was not just unavailable. He was impossible, which, as anyone familiar with longing can tell you, only makes things worse. Some women made their feelings plainly known. Nobles sent lavish gifts to specific monasteries, always the same ones, with donations conspicuously timed around feast days when a certain brother would be more visible in the garden or at prayer. Others requested private spiritual guidance more often than spiritual urgency strictly warranted. One abbey in England eventually wrote a very formal letter to a wealthy widow, requesting that she kindly cease delivering personal pies to Brother Matthew. His peace of mind is imperiled, it read. An elegant way of saying, please stop seducing the monks with pastry. Others were more subtle. They wrote carefully worded letters addressed to the abbot, the prior, or the scriptorium, but the true intent of the message lay within. A hidden line. A pressed flower. A particular phrase. One such note survives, pale ink on brittle parchment, your prayers reach me. But it is your voice that stirs the corners of my solitude. The note arrived wrapped around a sachet of dried rose petals. The sentiment could not have been clearer. Of course, monks were expected to resist. And many did. With sincerity. With effort. Some fasted. Some prayed through the night. Some asked to be reassigned to remote locations. But not all succeeded. Not always. There are records of monks who fell in love. Who ran. Who married. Who vanished. One such story comes from the 14th century, when a Franciscan friar fell in love with the daughter of a miller. He wrestled with it. Fasted for days. Slept on bare stone. Burned his own sandals as penance. But in the end, he left the monastery. He married the girl. They opened a tavern in the next village. Their sign reportedly read, "Praise be," and passed the ale. The tavern did not thrive. But the tale did. Even contemporary romance guides acknowledged this strange thread. Some were cautious, encouraging women to redirect their feelings into religious devotion. Others leaned into the metaphor. You are the warmth that guides me through Lent. Your silence is the echo of my longing. Lines like these appeared in the margins of sermons, stitched into samplers, or carved in the bark of trees. If you were going to fall in love with a monk, at least try to make it poetic. One of the more memorable confessions comes from 1361, when a girl admitted to her priest that she had become consumed with desire for Brother Elias. The priest, uncertain how to proceed, ordered her to eat nothing but porridge for a week and keep complete silence. She obeyed. She returned the following Lent with the same confession. Apparently, porridge does little to dim affection. Some monks responded with severity. There are writings condemning the foolishness of women who cast their eyes through the cloister gate. Others withdrew from public life, taking on more restrictive vows or seeking solitude in faraway hermitages. One monk in Bohemia famously climbed a tree and stayed there for 2 days after a young woman tried to offer him a pear. No one knows whether he was more afraid of sin or of conversation. But he was not disturbed again, and yet, not every story ends in retreat. In one small French priory, a novice monk and a local girl fell into a quiet rhythm of communication. They never touched. They never met in secret. But they exchanged messages slipped into the pages of borrowed psalters. Their words were small, cautious, and tender. When he died young, she gave up her dowry and donated it to the monastery. Years later, their notes were discovered written in the margins of his psalter, alongside pressed violets. The ink was faded, but the flowers still carried a trace of scent. There were, of course, the impersonators. In countless love poems, men pretended to be monks to win favor or gain trust. Some wrote in the voice of religious devotion as a mask for courtship. Others went further. One story tells of a young man who shaved his head, borrowed a habit, and entered a convent garden at night to declare his love to a woman through the lattice. He was caught. He was punished. She married him anyway. Perhaps it was the gesture. Perhaps the foolhardy devotion. Or perhaps, simply, she had been waiting for someone to climb the wall. The church, unsurprisingly, did not share the romance of it all. Ecclesiastical councils warned against such behavior. Women were told not to approach monasteries alone. Confession was to be approached with guarded hearts. Sermons were preached on the dangers of misplaced affection. But love does not answer to counsels. It slips between the lines. It waits under the gooseberry bush, and so, here you are, the monk lifts his head, for the briefest of moments, his eyes find yours. He does not smile. He does not speak. But he sees you. And in that small, soundless recognition, your heart forgets to beat. The air smells of sage and turned earth. A crow calls somewhere behind you. He lowers his gaze again and resumes his work, and you, your hand still resting on a leaf you never meant to touch, begin to murmur a psalm. You do not remember all the words. But it is not for penance. And not quite for prayer. It is for something older and quieter. The heart, like the soul, sometimes only wants a place to whisper. You are standing in the back room of an apothecary, and the air here is thick, almost unbearably so, with the layered scent of the past. Crushed herbs mingle with beeswax and old smoke, sharp floral notes jostling against the bitter musk of dried roots and the faint, rusty tang of something that might be blood or perhaps only the lingering breath of long-settled iron. It clings to your skin and seeps into your clothes, curling at the edges of your nostrils and lodging somewhere just behind your eyes. Dust floats through beams of weak sunlight that filter in through warped wooden shutters, each speck catching and holding the light as though reluctant to let it go. The shelves are lined with jars and stoppered bottles. Bundles of brittle stems tied with fraying twine, and parcels so aged that their paper has yellowed into near transparency. The labels are faded into obscurity or scrawled in a looping hand whose alphabet slips just beyond your comprehension. It feels like stepping into a room where time has curled in on itself, where secrets sit quietly on every surface and breath comes slowly, as though the very air resists being disturbed. The woman behind the counter does not speak. She does not smile. She simply watches you with a gaze that is neither cold nor warm, only measuring. She might once have been a midwife, her hands guiding life into the world. Or a widow, familiar with grief and the quiet endurance that follows. Perhaps even a nun, turned from the cloister to something more private, more veiled. Now she is something that sits between titles. A healer. A matchmaker. A whispering figure whose name may appear in more warnings than greetings. Some call her a wise woman. Others a witch. Her hands move without hesitation, their skin darkened by sun and age, by years of grinding, steeping again, and wrapping things too potent to name. She slides a small bundle across the deeply worn wood of the table toward you. The bundle is wrapped in linen, tied with black thread, its corners smudged with something like ash or dried petals. She does not explain. She does not need to. Inside the bundle are 3 sprigs of yarrow, their leaves fine and feathery. A length of red thread, twisted just once. And something else, a torn scrap of linen, pale and soft-edged, that might very well have come from a garment worn too close to someone's skin. Perhaps even from a pair of underthings. You could ask. But you don't ask anything at all, because you have just purchased a love charm. Welcome to the hidden world that hummed quietly beneath the grand tapestries of medieval romance. A world not of knights and troubadours, but of longing steeped in secrecy. A place where desperation could be folded into cloth, where hope could be whispered over boiling herbs, and where a person aching to be loved might turn to magic with the same trembling sincerity they gave to prayer. It was a world of quiet rituals, of herbs tied in twine, and of undergarments that carried more meaning than any poem ever could. Let us begin with what was believed, in the medieval imagination. Love was never simple. It was not merely a sentiment passed through song or sealed with a ring. Love was expansive. It touched the stars, the weather, the turn of the moon, and the bitter taste of an herb chewed before dawn. It was spiritual and physical, sacred and dangerous. The planets had opinions. The air held secrets. And sometimes, with the right combination of words and materials, love could be bent, stirred, pulled. The church, of course, condemned all of it. Love magic was denounced from pulpits as heretical, deceptive, the work of spirits best left uninvited. Sermons thundered warnings. Confessionals listened for whispers of guilt. But the people who turned to love charms often did so not out of wickedness, but out of quiet fear. Out of loneliness. Out of the aching silence that comes when desire goes unanswered, and despite the threats, they kept turning. Whether these rituals were widely practiced in every village or only surfaced in the records because they shocked those who wrote them down, historians still debate. But there are enough traces, tucked into court testimony, scribbled on the margins of devotional books, half sung in the verses of wandering ballads, to know that this was no rare curiosity. It was real. It was present. It was believed in. Some methods were simple. Some were strange. Let us begin with the cloth. A charm might require a piece of clothing worn close to the skin. The more personal, the better. A shirt still bearing the crease of a shoulder. A shift stained with sweat. A piece of hose softened by wear. Once obtained, the cloth could be folded beneath a threshold, hidden inside a mattress, or buried in a garden plot where the beloved would walk. Other times, it was boiled with rosemary, nettle, and rose petals while a spoken wish curled from the lips like steam from the pot. A 15th century spellbook from southern Italy describes a ritual where a man's stocking is sliced, then pressed into a dried apple. The fruit is pierced with cloves and cinnamon, wrapped tightly in red silk, and worn beneath the chest for 9 nights. If done with pure intention, the marginal note reads, "He will speak his vows before the 11th sunrise," but not every charm smelled of spice and silk. Some were crafted with more intimate ingredients, strands of hair plucked from a comb, nail clippings wrapped in wax, a drop of sweat gathered from a pillow, even the lingering salt of a tear caught before it touched the ground. Sympathy magic, it was called. The belief that a small part could be used to touch the whole. That something held or consumed or burned could reach through the unseen and stir the heart of another. It was not always about drawing someone near, often, it was about keeping someone close. Jealousy was no stranger to these rooms. In a letter recovered from a noblewoman's archives, she writes, "His glance now wanders. I scent no longing in his voice." Her remedy was a charm worn at the breast, rose hips, iron filings, clover, and a sliver of bone wrapped in velvet, meant to shield a bond from temptation. Meant to protect what prayers alone could not. Then there were the love knots, cords of colored thread, red to rouse passion, gold to bind loyalty, tied in shapes learned from moonlight and memory. Some knots were inscribed with Latin prayers. Others held stitched hearts, rough but earnest. Worn around the wrist, hidden at the thigh, or placed beneath a lover's pillow, they were quiet hopes given form. Simple gestures, trying to hold back the pull of doubt, and still, there were mirrors. One charm advised placing a small mirror under your pillow, whispering the name of the one you longed for 3 times before sleep. Their face, it said, would come to you in dream. No promise was given about what expression they would wear. But the dream would come. Or so the charm claimed. Neckaches were often reported. Answers, less often. Naturally, the church disapproved. Priests spoke against these practices, branding them not just foolish but dangerous. Confessors were taught to ask after herbs and charms, to press for truth about sachets and sigils. Items involving blood or underwear were viewed with particular suspicion. To own one could be enough for punishment. But enforcement was not always consistent. In rural places, a priest might look the other way if the sachet was called a poultice for sleep. After all, it was not always easy to tell the difference between a prayer and a plea disguised in petals. Where there was magic, there were countercharms. Those who suspected enchantment sought help from cunning folk, women with knowledge of how to unmake what others had tied. Salted baths were common. So were smudges burned in corners. One particularly theatrical solution involved slapping the bewitched with a dried eel while reciting scripture backwards. "Let the eel carry away what words cannot confront," the text said. There were no notes on how well it worked, nor on how often it was attempted, and not every charm was used for love. Some were crafted for kindness, for luck, or simply for attention. A recipe from Provence advises placing a sprig of rue soaked in vinegar inside a man's boot to soften him toward financial generosity. No word on whether the charm or the vinegar made the greater impression, but underneath the strangeness, beneath the folded cloth and whispered words, there was something deeply human. Each charm, each knot, each herb wrapped in string was an attempt to be seen, to be wanted, to be chosen. They were made not out of malice, but out of aching hope. Quiet acts of courage in a world where love often arrived too late or not at all, in a time when most marriages were arranged, when desire had to be hidden or coded, when feelings could not always be spoken aloud. These small rituals became a language of their own. A form of resistance. A prayer disguised as a spell. And now, here you stand, still in the apothecary's back room, the scent of yarrow clinging to your sleeve, the charm tucked into your pocket, its warmth pressing faintly through the cloth. You do not speak. You pay in silver. You promise, silently, that no priest will ever hear of this. The door creaks as it opens. The cool air of evening brushes against your face. The garden outside is dim and quiet, the last light slipping between leaves. Is it magic, or is it simply the act of doing something when your heart has no other way to speak? Whatever it is, something within you steadies. Just slightly. Your steps feel firmer as you go, and for now, that is enough. You are standing outside the tailor's shop, boots firmly planted in the chilly muck of a cobbled street, your breath curling upward as you stare with undisguised yearning through the fogged windowpane. Behind the wavering glass, just beyond a tumble of folded linen and scraps of coarse wool, hangs a pair of velvet hose. They are deep green, the color of summer ivy in shadow, and so finely stitched that the very air around them seems to hum with promise. You want them. Fiercely. Not because they will keep you warm through a bitter winter. Not because they boast unparalleled durability. Not even because they are the latest whisper of elegance drifting down from distant noble courts. You want them because you should not have them, you cannot afford them, not in coin, not in class, not even in theory. By the precise wording of the local laws, by the edicts etched into the records of the town, and by the watchful judgment of every guild clerk and parish official, you are not permitted to wear them. Not now. Not ever. Not even for a moment. Because this desire, this pull toward beauty, is not simply a matter of indulgence. It is a matter of legality. Welcome to the curious, rigorously enforced, and strangely influential world of sumptuary laws. These were no idle suggestions. These were the medieval codes of appearance. Laws that dictated who could wear what, where, and for what purpose. Laws that quietly decided who was allowed to look charming, impressive, or even faintly desirable in public. In this time, your ability to appear elegant, to signal attraction, to express charm through clothing, was not just a question of taste or money. It was bounded by authority. You could be clever, kind, even beautiful, but if your hemline was too long, if your belt shone too brightly, if your boots buckled with too much flair, you could be fined, censured, or shamed. Fashion was not freedom. It was a boundary. And sometimes, that boundary was lined in thread finer than silk. These sumptuary laws were written with care. They were itemized in painstaking detail. Royal proclamations, town ordinances, guild regulations, and even church mandates laid out exactly what fabrics could be worn, what colors were reserved, which styles were acceptable, and which adornments would bring punishment. A farmer could not dress like a tradesman. A tradesman could not imitate the nobility. Nobles were prohibited from imitating royalty. It was a finely tuned ladder of cloth and thread, and each rung was strictly guarded. Why such laws existed is a question scholars still puzzle over. Some argue they were meant to protect local industries, shielding towns from the economic threat of imported luxury. Others believe they were tools of political control, designed to keep social classes visibly distinct and undeniably separate. Still others suggest they were moral campaigns, born of fear that vanity and sensual display would corrode virtue. In truth, the laws likely served all three purposes at once. But beneath each thread, each paragraph, each inspection, there was a single idea: beauty, if it strayed from its assigned rank, could become a kind of danger. Consider the details. In 14th century England, only families of noble birth were permitted to wear garments trimmed with ermine. Velvet dyed in rare pigments, its colors rich as midnight wine, was reserved for men of knightly status and above. Silk was restricted. Pearls forbidden to those without official title. Even color itself was regulated. Deep crimson, royal blue, saturated indigo, these were more than hues. They were signals of power, of wealth, of desirability. They glowed with implication. They warned the viewer not to mistake the wearer for anything less than elite. Red, especially, carried weight. It was the color of allure and authority. A woman without noble status who dared to wear red silk risked being seen as a pretender. Or worse, as a seductress. In some towns, she would be fined. In others, she might be punished publicly, made to scrub market stalls under the watchful eye of a crowd, or paraded in a plain hood painted with false jewels, a mockery of her ambition. Her sin was not theft. It was the audacity of looking too fine. Men were not spared these restrictions. Their fashion, too, was policed. In some cities, the absurdly long pointed shoes known as polaines were allowed only for the upper classes. In others, hats decorated with feathers were expressly banned for peasants. Gold embroidery, a mark of high birth or heraldic privilege, could not be worn by anyone without proven lineage. One popular cautionary tale told of a merchant's son whose sleeves were so extravagantly wide that they caught fire from a roast spit at a feast. He survived the burns. His reputation did not. Officials cited the incident as proof: fashion must reflect your station, not your ambition. And what has any of this to do with love? Everything. In this world, clothing was not just fabric. It was message. It declared your worth, your availability, your possibilities. It informed others who you were allowed to pursue and who was permitted to pursue you. If you wore something too fine, you were seen as dishonest, as presumptuous, as someone reaching above their place. And for those who dared to hope for love that crossed the lines of class or wealth, fashion became both a dangerous disguise and an unspoken confession. Imagine the village square in the glow of lanterns. There is music, laughter, a gathering of neighbors and strangers. You arrive quietly, hoping to draw the gaze of someone whose life gleams far above yours. But your clothes are drab. Your tunic is coarse brown, the only color permitted to someone of your occupation. Your sleeves are modest, your buttons plain. The knight across the square wears green velvet with silver edging and boots laced high with polished leather. He sparkles. You blur. He is admired. You are unnoticed. Still, people resisted the rules. In France, tailors honed their craft not only to dress the powerful but to outwit the laws. They found ways to elevate modest garments, layering cloth to create weight, brushing rough fabric to give it luster, blending root dyes to mimic the tones of forbidden hues. In the Low Countries, secret fashions bloomed. Lovers stitched messages in hidden threads. They wore slivers of velvet tucked into pockets. They sewed fur into linings. These were private rebellions. The kind visible only in the flick of a sleeve or the flash of a hem. One story remains, passed down from a small German town. A girl, quiet and clever, stitched a single narrow ribbon of red silk into the inside of her sleeve. It was small. Hidden. It peeked out only when she reached for someone's hand. At a midsummer gathering, she reached. Her intended saw the flash of red. He smiled. He took her hand. That was their love story. Unspoken. Unlawful. Unforgettable. As always, the church responded with fury. Sermons thundered against vanity, against the dangerous mingling of beauty and ambition. One friar in Yorkshire is recorded as shouting, "The devil favors a well-dressed ankle," to a stunned congregation. Ironically, that same friar was reprimanded months later for ordering silk altar cloths from France. The hypocrisy was familiar. One bishop obsessed over women's bodices while commissioning embroidered pillows for his chamber. Another banned low-cut gowns while surrounding himself with swan feather tapestries. The truth was never about fabric. It was about fear. Fear of what fabric represented, because these laws had consequences. They shaped the boundaries of love. They told people who could be desired, who could be imagined, who was considered a fitting match. Clothing became a code. A language of dreams and limits. A tunic was never just a tunic. It was a signal. A challenge. A hope. And you, still standing before the tailor's glowing window, are faced with a choice. You can step away and buy the regulation wool tunic, its gray dye flat and honest, its sleeves cut to specification. Or you can take a risk. You can ignore the frowns of the guild masters, the whispers of the town elders, the priest's watching eye, and reach instead for the velvet hose, the one stitched in thread that glimmers with forbidden gold. You make your decision, and when you slip them on, your reflection in the window is different. It holds its head a little higher. Its spine straightens. Its gaze sharpens with something that looks like defiance and hope in equal measure, because love may be blind. But the sumptuary laws, they see everything. You are ankle-deep in mud, the hem of your cloak soggy with muck and perfumed unmistakably with the lingering scent of roasted turnips, and just a moment ago, someone pressed a meat pie into your hand that may or may not still be making the faintest sound of protest. You're uncertain if it's steam or a whimper. Regardless, congratulations are in order. You have arrived at a medieval village festival. The music hums and stumbles somewhere nearby, half a beat off rhythm, half a note off key. The ale in your cup is slightly sour, possibly left over from the last feast day, but no one seems to mind. The air is thick with smoke, with laughter, with the shrill joy of a fiddle struggling to keep up with the dancer's feet. And underneath it all, something else shivers just beneath the surface. Something like anticipation. Because here, in this muddied clearing, beneath pennants flapping from tilted poles and laughter rising into the sky, lies something more than revelry. Here lies opportunity, because if you are looking for love, and you are not overly particular about matters like personal hygiene or symmetrical teeth, then this is your moment. Welcome to the medieval world's most chaotic matchmaking system. This is not the realm of embroidered letters or swooning glances over lute music. This is the rustic, rowdy, remarkably effective social engine of the village festival. A space where romance is born not from poetry but from proximity. Not from noble lineage but from lucky collisions. Not from roses and rhymes, but from shared cider and a strong showing at the competitive cheese rolling event. Let us set the scene with the fullness it deserves. These festivals were never just celebrations of saints or seasonal shifts. They were more than rituals to mark harvests, solstices, or holy days. They were living, pulsing gatherings, social centers for communities who, for most of the year, rarely traveled more than a few fields from their doorsteps. A feast day or fair was not just an excuse to eat well. It was a portal. For the unmarried, especially, it was a rare and electrifying window into possibility. A single afternoon might offer the chance to lock eyes with someone new. Or at the very least, someone whose family had not already attempted to arrange a union involving 2 cows and a cart. For those not yet wed, the stakes were high and the energy thick with intent. These were the days when eyes met across bonfires and names were exchanged in the shade of hay carts. Whether or not they were officially encouraged by local authorities as courting spaces, festivals became, quite organically, the beating heart of rural flirtation. And the evidence of their importance is stitched into the songs, games, and grievances that survive. The signs of courtship were vivid and plentiful. Young women arrived with hair unbraided, cascading over shoulders in soft waves. This was no fashion accident. It was a known, culturally legible signal of being unmarried. Young men, meanwhile, often adorned themselves with garlands, silly hats made of straw or rushes, or even feathers scavenged from a nearby goose. There was no attempt at subtlety. This was not a world of reserved smiles or discreet conversation. This was a world of laughter, of shouts, of accidental nudges during games and unintended slips into someone else's arms during dancing. Ah, the dancing. At the heart of many a festival stood the maypole, tall, bright, and wrapped in a spiral of color. Ribbons dangled from its crown like the arms of the season itself, and couples danced in weaving circles, braiding those ribbons into a vibrant spiral of spring. Some believe the pole represented fertility, others say it was just a joyous excuse to twirl in the sun. Either way, legend said that if your ribbons became tangled with someone else's by the end of the dance, you had been chosen by the season's blessing. You were encouraged, gently and publicly, to consider each other's company. And more than one marriage began in that tangled step. Games offered further avenues for romance. One involved hiding small tokens, walnuts, ribbons, painted eggs, among heaps of hay. Boys and girls paired off to hunt for them, often tripping over each other in the process. A token meant a kiss. 2 meant a song. More than that? Who knew? Some pairings lasted the afternoon. Some lasted a lifetime. Others ended with sneezing and awkward glances exchanged across church pews for the next 6 months. The hand-fasting tradition was particularly intriguing. At many festivals, couples could agree to a trial marriage, binding themselves for 1 year and 1 day. This was an officially recognized partnership, often witnessed by the community. If the pairing worked, it could be made permanent. If not, they parted ways without scandal, perhaps with a few raised eyebrows and a teasing song sung by a local child. A surprisingly modern notion, wrapped in medieval garb, and of course, there was music. Minstrels and musicians wandered between stalls and fires, singing bawdy, mischievous tunes that sent laughter tumbling across the village green. Some were hired. Others simply showed up. The lyrics were bold, often confusing, occasionally suggestive. One popular Norfolk tune included the line, "She poured ale and smiled with eyes that stirred the soup." The words were peculiar. The meaning was unmistakable. Food, naturally, played its part in the courtship process. Roasted apples, dripping with sweetness, were handed over as gifts. Honeyed bread and soft cheese were broken and shared between tentative fingers. Offering someone the best slice of your pie was considered a gesture of affection. Letting them drink from your cup was a promise. Stealing their pie and drinking from their cup. That was marriage in all but name. As with most earthly joy, the church had firm opinions. Clergymen grumbled. Priests scolded. Bishops attempted to legislate. May Day, in particular, drew their ire. One bishop called it a hotbed of spiritual mildew, and another tried to replace the maypole with a statue of Saint Agnes. The villagers, not to be thwarted, simply tied ribbons to the statue too. Dancing was condemned. Hand-fasting was frowned upon. But none of it stopped. Because the festival did not belong to the church. It belonged to the people, and the people were inventive. One charming tradition involved girls whispering their names into jugs and leaving them at the village well. Boys would draw a jug at random, and whoever's name they found inside was their partner for the dance. The chances of finding true love were slim. The chances of finding entertainment were excellent. Sometimes, these games spilled into more elaborate theatrics. On certain feast days, peasants dressed as lords and ladies. The clothes were borrowed or invented, the titles made up, the accents exaggerated. And sometimes, in the blur of role-play and revelry, something real emerged. One story survives from Derby: a boy wooed a girl while pretending to be a visiting duke. He wore a borrowed cloak and an impressive feathered hat. She fell for him anyway, knowing full well he was just the cooper's son with a gift for pretending. And then there were the quiet moments. The ones that lasted: a spilled drink, a race gone wrong, a shared laugh in the mud. One woman, many years later, recalled the first time she met her husband. "I fell on his pie," she said. "He offered me half. I married him for that. And now, here you are, standing still in the middle of the crowd, the smell of bean stew and wood smoke in your nose. You lock eyes with someone across the stand. They smile. You smile back. You both reach for the last honey cake. Your fingers touch, briefly. Warm. Curious. The lute music behind you shifts, climbing just a little. You do not speak. You do not need to, because this is not courtly love. It is not embroidered sonnets or guarded glances from balconies. It is not secret rings or night-blooming roses. This is real, and it smells of sheep, cinnamon, and possibility. You are sitting stiffly on a hard wooden bench, your spine too straight for comfort, in a cold, damp stone room where even the corners seem to sweat. The air hangs thick and unmoving, pressed down by the mingled scents of melting candle wax, musty rushes, and something unmistakably vegetal that can only be described as old onions left too long in a basket. Your hands are folded tightly in your lap, fingers tangled in each other like anxious vines. Your tunic, once neat, is now rumpled and creased, bearing the unmistakable signature of long hours spent waiting with no soft place to rest. You are not in a chapel. You are not seated at a banquet where songs are sung and glances are stolen. You are in a courtroom. And not the kind found in romantic tales, where bold lovers plead their cases before sympathetic kings. No. This is a court of law. And somehow, against all your better judgment and every quiet warning from your friends, your latest foray into medieval romance has brought you here. Not for anything quaint like poorly written love poetry or a tragically off-key serenade. Not for something that might be laughed away with ale and forgiveness. You are here for what can only be described as a full-blown legal catastrophe of the heart. Welcome to the tangled, awkward, and surprisingly well-documented world of medieval relationship litigation. In this world, love gone wrong did not simply wither in private or slink away in silence. It was dragged, willingly or not, into the public eye. Into courtrooms where tears mixed with testimony, where promises were dissected word by word, and where the fallout of affection was recorded for the ages. The most common cause for these courtroom dramas: a breach of promise. In many corners of medieval Europe, if a man proposed marriage aloud in the presence of witnesses and then later changed his mind or failed to follow through, the woman had legal recourse. She could take him to court. And often, she did. These were not symbolic acts of social protest. These were formal, civil legal cases, complete with judges, scribes, witnesses, and consequences. If found guilty, a man might be fined, forced to deliver a public apology, or in rare instances, ordered to marry the woman whose hopes he had raised. Sometimes all three, yes, it was entirely possible to be legally required to wed someone simply because of something you said in passing one festival evening after your second mug of honeyed ale and a slightly ill-advised compliment. Historians still discuss the limits of these verbal contracts, with some regions relying on local laws and others guided more by canon law. What mattered most was intent. Was the promise sincere? Were there witnesses? Did someone believe themselves bound by it? And once the case reached the court, what had started as a private misunderstanding became a public affair. Take, for example, the case of Matilda of Ely in the year 1321. She was the daughter of a modest tradesman, and during the midsummer fair, a farmer's son took her hand and promised marriage. 3 neighbors heard it. A passing goat, for reasons never explained, was also present. Later, the young man tried to escape his commitment, claiming a sudden spiritual awakening and vague divine instructions to pursue a different path. Matilda, understandably unconvinced, took him to court. The judge ruled in her favor, citing the presence of witnesses and the distress caused to her reputation. The young man was fined the value of a good cow and made to pen a written apology, which, it must be said, was found to contain several truly unfortunate spelling errors, but these cases were not brought by women alone. In a lesser-known but equally curious trial from medieval Germany, a young man sued a noblewoman after she kissed him behind a dovecot and later denied any intention of engagement. He claimed the kiss was a public promise of marriage. Her defense? That it had been dark and she had mistaken him for someone else. The court, perhaps swayed by her noble status or the simple logic of the excuse, found her not guilty. The young man quietly left town soon after, though whether from humiliation or due to vengeful pigeons remains unclear, another frequent courtroom presence. The enticement case: if someone attempted to woo away a betrothed partner, especially if they succeeded, they could be brought before the court for seduction or disruption. This was more than social scandal. It was a legal matter. Plaintiffs accused rivals of using underhanded tactics, from whispered promises to actual charms. Even excessive personal allure could be cited as cause. One case from the city of York stands out. A baker's apprentice was taken to court by a furious father, who claimed the young man had disturbed his daughter's engagement by singing overly romantic ballads beneath her window at night. The complaint included a note that the songs had also disturbed several ducks. The court dismissed the matter of the ducks but warned the apprentice sternly, no more serenading after evening prayers. Cases could grow far more serious, sometimes. Love was promised in exchange for physical affection. And when marriage did not follow, the courts became involved. Women would testify that they had surrendered themselves believing that a wedding was imminent. Midwives were summoned. Neighbors were questioned. One woman cried, "He said I was his only moon," to which the accused replied that he had meant it metaphorically. The court was unmoved, but the reverse was also true. Men occasionally found themselves married by accident, as it were, through miscommunication or enthusiasm mistaken for commitment. One famous tale comes from Toulouse, where a man agreed far too eagerly to every sweet thing said during a hayride. The young woman took this as a proposal. Her brothers did too. A few days later, the man was in court. His defense, that he had simply enjoyed the hayride, was not accepted. The court ruled that he had shown an unwise level of enthusiasm. He remained married. The church had its own parallel court system, focused more on spiritual and moral matters. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with sins of the flesh, promises made in confession, adultery, and fornication. They did not issue prison sentences but could demand public penance, exile, or fines. And their records, many of which still survive, read like tragic plays written in the margins of history. One such document preserves the words of a heartbroken woman: "My lover did say, on the eve of St. Bridget, that I was the only rose in his garden, and that he would pluck no other." Her voice, even in parchment and ink, carries pain. And yet, he plucked. Another man admitted under oath to writing the same poem to two different women. Both were as moonlight, he said. I did not believe they would compare notes. The court fined him heavily and sentenced him to weekly recitations of penitential psalms. There were even trials brought for spite, revenge suits, filed not for justice but for humiliation. One woman accused her former lover of dishonesty and bad technique. The court, surprisingly, agreed. He was declared emotionally dishonest and unpleasing to the mouth, a judgment no amount of flattery could erase. Of course, not every case was about love itself. Dowry fraud, bigamy, false annulments, and tax-evading fake marriages were all dragged into court as well. In one amusing instance, a couple pretended to be married for years to avoid certain levies. When asked why, they simply answered, because it was easier. A sentiment that continues to resonate. And then, of course, there is the infamous pie incident. In Bruges, 1389, a man claimed his sweetheart bewitched him into proposing by feeding him a pie laced with enchanted herbs. She denied everything. The pie, she said, was simply chicken. Love, she added, is rarely as simple as a spell. The court agreed and told the man, in no uncertain terms, to stop telling people he had been hexed by poultry. Now here you are, still seated on that same stiff wooden bench, every bone aching slightly from the cold. You await the verdict. You had written a letter. You had quoted a song. Perhaps you were too poetic. Perhaps too bold. The recipient claims you promised marriage. You argue it was a harmless line borrowed from a troubadour. The judge sighs. So does the crowd. Even the scribe lets his quill hang for a moment in midair. At last, the ruling is announced. You are fined one small basket of eggs and required to issue a formal apology. Not privately. Not in writing. But in the middle of the market square, in full view of your neighbors and that one man who sells fish and always smells like it. You obey, because in the world of medieval romance, love was not just a matter of hearts and flowers. It was a matter of ink, of benches, of testimony, of law. It was something written down, judged, declared. In short, it was a matter of public record. You are walking along the quiet side path of the village, the kind of narrow, winding lane that curves gently like a question yet to be asked. It weaves between leaning stone walls and sun-warmed wooden fences, the kind that have seen generations of hands brush across them and have grown soft at the edges from time and weather. Moss creeps slowly but steadily up every available surface, painting the world in slow strokes of green, like the very presence of time made visible. The ground beneath your boots is soft with yesterday's rain, damp earth pressing back against your soles with each step, releasing a faint, satisfying squelch. The air around you carries a subtle perfume of life lived quietly. There is the smell of wet thatch softening under the sun, of old lavender hung from beams seasons ago, now faded but still holding something of its former sweetness. From somewhere far off, wood smoke curls up from chimneys, drifting lazily across the rooftops and into the open sky. Overhead, the sun has begun its slow descent, casting long golden rays across everything it touches. The light pours like warm honey across stone walls and crooked fences, turning even the most time-worn cottages into places of quiet beauty. Shadows stretch themselves along the path, long and soft-edged, like sleepy animals settling in for the night, as you move beneath the shade of a leaning elm tree whose branches sway gently in the hush of late afternoon. Your attention is drawn to a pair of figures standing nearby. One is a woman whose hair carries streaks of gray, woven like fine silver thread through the darker strands. Her face is lined, not sharply, but softly, like a map of a life well noticed. Her expression is unreadable at first glance, and then you see it, a small smile, subtle and knowing, tucked neatly into the corners of her mouth, like a secret only she is in on. You nod politely, just as local custom suggests. She nods in return, with a quiet, deliberate grace. Then, leaning slightly toward the much younger girl at her side, she says, without lowering her voice in the least, that one's a good catch for a widow. And just like that, without your consent or preparation, you find yourself drawn, perhaps by accident, perhaps by fate, into the surprisingly layered and often hopeful world of second chances in medieval love. This is the quiet kingdom of widows and widowers, a realm built of whispered speculations, shared glances, and a slow churn of village gossip that travels faster than any cart and hits harder than any sermon. It is a world where love is not always new, but always possible. We begin, as so many of these stories do, with the widows. Forget the familiar image of the sorrowful figure cloaked in black, shrouded in grief and banished to a corner of society. In truth, medieval widows often inhabited far more powerful roles. Many were not only respected but actively courted. They held real economic and social leverage. They controlled property, managed households, and in some cases even ran businesses passed down from their husbands. Unlike the heavily monitored lives of maidens, widows were no longer under their father's guardianship. They could speak their minds. They could participate in village decisions. And, perhaps most importantly, they could decide. Often for the first time in their lives, whether they wanted to remarry, and if so, who would be worthy. Of course, scholars still argue over how universally true this was. Some claim this agency was limited to certain regions, certain towns, or certain social classes where wealth and land ownership offered a buffer. But records scattered across Europe reveal a pattern. Many women who outlived their husbands found themselves not diminished but newly equipped to chart their own futures. A widow might live quietly and never marry again. Or she might seek, or be sought by, a second love, one chosen on her terms. A well-known poem from the 13th century captured this sensibility with poetic force. It described a widow as a ship with no captain, yet with sails full of wind. Interpret that however you like, but the meaning seems clear. She may be unanchored, but she is moving. Her journey is not over. It has simply changed course, and the suitors. They came, they arrived with varying degrees of grace, charm, and intent. Some were younger men looking for stability. Others were older, seeking comfort in familiar hands. Merchants were drawn by dowries or land. There were even clergymen, long since relaxed in their vows, who found themselves drawn to a widow's kitchen as much as her conversation. Not all were noble in motive. Not all were sincere. But to the widow, the attention itself was not surprising. It was the choosing that mattered. In the court records of Kent, a notable case appears. A widow accepted a marriage proposal from a local brewer barely 3 months after her husband's burial. Tongues wagged. Neighbors whispered. But when asked if she had moved on too quickly, she replied plainly, "I prefer barrels to gravestones." It was not the answer people expected. It was the answer she gave, and then, as always, came the matchmakers. Older women, often retired from midwifery or herbal practice, took on this role with devotion. They needed no charts or scrolls. They worked from memory, instinct, and endless observation. They tracked every unspoken tension, every family feud, every broken betrothal. They remembered who owed whom 3 eggs, whose daughter cried after Candlemas, and which farmer's son had a decent enough jaw when cleaned. They remembered everything. They made quiet connections over lentil soup and cabbage stew. They pulled threads where others saw knots. Their strategies were many. A walk suggested by accident near a barley field. A loaf of bread passed hand to hand just a little too slowly. A comment about the ripeness of apples made within earshot of the orchard keeper. A visit from a friend of the family bearing a message that seemed strangely coordinated. Sometimes it was almost theatrical. But it worked. And no method moved faster than a well-placed whisper beside the village well, where truth and fiction blended faster than tea. The gossip network was relentless. All it took was a glance, a shared bench, a song hummed while passing. One person noticed you walking with the widow from the East Cottage more than once. Another saw you bring her fresh onions at the market. A third swore your initials were carved side by side on the millstone near the bridge. By the time you arrived at the bakery for your usual loaf, the baker's apprentice was already congratulating you on your engagement, and sometimes, impossibly, it turned out to be true, because second loves in the medieval world were not always kindled by passion. They were rooted in realism, in gratitude, in work shared and nights warmed by the presence of someone who simply stayed. People remarried not to write songs, but to survive the season, to raise children, to mend clothes in the same room where someone would notice if you stopped humming. Widowers, too, did not remain alone for long. Many remarried quickly, not from haste, but from necessity. Life demanded it. Fields needed tending. Bread needed baking. Children needed stories. Most men could not do all these things alone. And so they looked not for maidens, but for women who had already built lives. Women who did not swoon, but swept. Who did not flutter, but stood firm. Love appeared in unlikely places. Between former in-laws who once barely exchanged words. Between neighbors who had once squabbled over goats and now shared them. One will from 1423 famously stated, "To my second wife, who once threw soup at me in spring, I leave my best boots and half the goat." It was not poetic, but it was sincere. And sincerity, it turned out, was a stronger glue than most. Even older lovers were not excluded from the gentle chaos. In village life, age brought more than stiffness and stories. It brought reputation. It brought skill. One tale, passed down in the countryside, speaks of an elderly couple who met while chasing the same runaway pig. They caught it together, laughed, and married within the month. At their wedding, the priest reportedly said, "May your love be as stubborn and delightful as the pig." One assumes it was meant as a blessing. Even the church began to soften its approach. Early teachings discouraged remarriage, urging widows toward prayer and retreat. But over time, priests saw the value in warmth restored. Unwatched loneliness worried them more than second unions. A happy hearth was preferable to whispered scandal. A shared bed, they conceded, was sometimes holier than solitude. Matchmaking, meddling though it could be, often came from kindness. Communities looked after their own. They wanted joy to return. They wanted fires rekindled. They wanted laughter back in kitchens where only echoes had lived. Even if the laughter came while plucking feathers or chasing a chicken down a wet path. You, now, are still walking that winding path, boots pressing into moss-soft earth. Behind you, just faint enough to be carried by breeze, comes another whisper from the matchmaker behind the fence. This time, she says, he walks like someone who needs a warm hearth. You do not turn around. But something in your expression shifts. The corners of your mouth lift into a small smile you do not quite intend, because somewhere, in this world of second-hand tunics, smoky kitchens, and stories told in murmurs, someone may be waiting to begin again with you. And whether it starts with a formal vow, a casual suggestion, or nothing more than the shared task of peeling apples at dawn, the truth is this: you are not too late. Love in the Middle Ages came with rules. It came with judgment. It came with consequences. But it also came with grace. It came with space for another beginning, and another, and sometimes even one more after that. You are standing on a hillside now, just beyond the outermost edge of the village, where the last crooked fence posts give way to open land and the trees stretch their limbs wide into the gathering dusk. Here, the world feels older. The soil beneath your boots is dark and rich, softened by the recent rain, and as you shift your weight, it gives slightly, like a memory stirred from sleep. The scent in the air is deep and grounding, damp earth mingled with crushed leaves and the faint, crumbling sweetness of distant pine needles. Beneath it all, there is something else. Something ancient and impossible to name. A smell like stone warmed by centuries. Like time, settling on your shoulders without asking permission. Above you, the trees murmur. Their branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, rustling not wildly, but with purpose, as though they are speaking to one another in a slow, careful language. You do not know the words. You may never know them. But you feel the meaning all the same. It is not a warning. It is not a song. It is something simpler. Truer. A quiet message passed from root to leaf, from branch to sky. It says, stay. Listen, far away, softened by distance and wind, the bells of the village begin to chime. Their tones rise in slow sequence, each note climbing the hillside like a ribbon caught on the breeze. The hour is marked. Time continues below. Life ticks forward in the village square. Among the bread ovens and spinning wheels and gently closing shutters. But here, in this pocket of stillness, outside the borders of the known and familiar, none of that touches you. It is silent here, but not with the heavy silence of tension or fear. This silence is generous. It unrolls like a path. It gives you room. And slowly, gently, something inside you begins to settle. You are alone. But the feeling does not sting. It does not ache. Not tonight. Because tonight, standing here with the last gold of day fading against your skin, you are not only yourself. You carry with you every scrap of love you have witnessed in this strange, earnest, tangled medieval world. Every sweet, ridiculous, courageous, chaotic effort to connect with another soul now clings to you like the edges of a well-worn cloak. These memories are not loud. They do not demand. They simply exist, quietly, insistently, like stars that continue shining whether you look up or not, and somehow, somewhere between the cracked cobblestones of a marketplace and the shade beneath a leaning elm, it has all begun to make sense, in a world shaped by lineage and labor, by vows sworn more out of duty than desire. Love had to move differently. It could not always speak freely. It could not always step into the light. But it survived. It learned to live in the shadows, in the side glances, in the in-betweens. It learned how to stay alive in the smallest spaces. It whispered instead of shouted. It disguised itself in gifts no grander than a ribbon or a pear. It traveled through notes tucked into sleeves, or words scribbled in poor Latin and shaky ink. It glowed in the flicker of candlelight as one person lingered near another just long enough to mean something. It lived in crumbs of pie passed awkwardly across tables, in fingers brushed during dances, in laughter too loud and glances too long. It arrived out of rhythm, out of order. It stumbled into haylofts. It snuck behind chapels. It turned goat-chasing into a memory. It turned hayrides into contracts and spilled drinks into beginnings. It found a way to be present, even where it had no invitation, and though it was clumsy, it was real. It lived in things as small as a charm sewn into a hem. In things as strange as a serenade offered with more confidence than talent. In things as soft as a midwife's touch when her own heart was quietly breaking. In lavender trimmed too often. In onions offered without explanation. In one person noticing, and not looking away. Of course, it was messy. But then again, so was everything else. The roads were uneven. The roofs leaked. The bread didn't always rise. Yet love still happened. Not cleanly. Not perfectly. But genuinely. And sometimes, it didn't even need words. Sometimes all it took was a look. Or the shared silence of two people peeling apples side by side, just as prayers in that world were often spoken not in grandeur but in quiet. Hopeful repetition, love, too, found its power in repetition. In the everyday. In the decision to stay. To show up again. To offer warmth when the fire went out. To say, in action if not in words, I see you. You matter. Let me be near. You think now of the awkward moments. The moments that no poem would write down. The ones that live in the secret corners of memory because they were strange, or funny, or hard to explain. The ones where hearts reached out anyway, despite mud, despite fear, despite linen soaked with sweat or goats doing precisely the wrong thing. You try not to think about the armpit cloth. You try harder. But still, it arrives. And you laugh a little. And you forgive it. Because it meant something. Because they all did, and though the customs were complicated, layered with family ties and unspoken rules, the emotions were not. Those were simple. They were the same then as they are now. The medieval heart, as steeped as it was in church doctrine and seasonal labor, longed for the same things yours does, to be chosen. Not for wealth or status or acreage. But for something quiet and soft and human. To be known, really known, beneath the social roles and the practical expectations. To be called by the name no one else used. To be held close in a world that was often cold and hard and loud, to be enough, sometimes, to be smelled. But mostly, to be loved. And not abandoned. Now, as the sky deepens and the wind picks up slightly, carrying with it the first true chill of night, you feel the air shift. The moon has begun to rise behind the treetops, faint at first, like a coin held between two fingers. And as the shadows lengthen and the color bleeds from the hills, something within you begins to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But steadily, quietly. Like the tide. Like breath, you understand something. You cannot name it easily. But it is there. And it is enough. So you turn. Slowly. No need to hurry, you begin your descent from the hillside, your boots finding familiar ground again. Your steps are unhurried, steady, almost contemplative. There is no grand conclusion waiting for you at the bottom. No outstretched arms. No thunderous kiss. There is only the path, and the village below, and a sense of something whole beginning to take root inside you, because this journey you have taken, the one filled with matchmaking chickens, mistaken serenades, vows whispered beside barns and letters sent through bakers, was never about the spectacle. It was always leading here, to this feeling. This thought. This quiet, unshakable truth, that somewhere. In some muddy village square long ago, someone stood very still. They looked out across a crowd of people going about their day, merchants haggling, children running, dogs barking, midwives laughing, and they saw someone, and in that instant, something shifted. Not loudly. Not obviously. But deeply, and they thought, with absolute certainty, ah. There you are. And that, in all its stillness, was everything. The air is softer now. The breeze has grown still. The colors of the sky, once brilliant with stories told in starlight, have faded into something quieter. The horizon has given way to darkness so complete it feels like velvet stretched across the sky. The bells have stopped. The footsteps have vanished. The houses below have drawn in their light like breath taken before sleep. Above you, the leaves do not move. Below you, the fields rest. Around you, the hush settles in, you let yourself rest. There is no need to remember every awkward poem, every failed serenade. No need to hold on to the faint scent of rosemary clinging to that well-traveled handkerchief. You do not need to revisit the tale of the duck-related trial or the confused man who accidentally became a husband during a hayride. Those moments were funny, yes. But they were never the point. What remains is something else. Something deeper. It is the rhythm that lingers. The steady beat beneath all the missteps. The quiet hope that hummed beneath the noise. The effort it took to reach out, even when everything in the world said not to. The way people still tried to share a piece of bread, to offer a second glance, to leave behind a ribbon when no words could be trusted. It was never easy. Not then. Not now, but love never is. So now, as the edges of the world begin to soften and your thoughts blur gently into the warm haze of dream, you are allowed to let it all go. Let the stories rest. Let the memories fold themselves neatly away like winter linens. The jester, the monk, the quiet girl who stitched secrets into her sleeve, they will wait for you. They are patient. They have waited for centuries already. You are safe here, not wrapped in armor, not hidden beneath silks, but cloaked in something more enduring. The slow, steady understanding that love, odd, fumbling, human love, has always been here. And that it has always found a way. Close your eyes now. The moon is high above the village, a silent sentinel. The stars, weary from watching, are ready to sleep. You have wandered far tonight. Through fields and feast halls, across laws and laughter, through heartbreak and hope, and now, finally, you have arrived, you have earned your rest.